There seem to be some audio problems that reported in the chat.
We can. Pierre-Louis, do you have any problems hearing Michael?
No, I can hear you well.
I hear fine too.
Yeah. Okay. So let's get started slowly. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second EBRD and King's College London workshop on the economics and politics of migration.
I think we lost Jevat, huh?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Great.
Okay, great. So let me do the quick welcome and we will get started. So again, welcome to the second EBRD and King's College London workshop on the economics and politics of migration. My name is Cevat Kirayaksoy. I'm a principal economist at EBRD and lecturer at King's College London. And with Kostas and Pierre-Louis, we are very happy to see so many familiar faces, friends and colleagues here today, and thanks for joining us. Before we start, I would like to say a few words about the workshop. In this
Jevat, we lost you again.
I think
there's feedback. You're getting feedback.
Okay, that is very strange. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, really sorry about this. I don't know why this is happening. So quick words about the workshop. Pierre-Louis, if this thing happens again, please take over the control and chair the session. Clearly, there's a problem with my Zoom account now. So quick word about the. Okay.
All right, I just wanted to say welcome to everyone and thanks for joining us today. Just want to say the format about this session. So it's going to be 35 minutes per paper for this panel. And so 20 minutes for the speaker, then 7 minutes for the discussant, then 7 minutes for general discussion. If we deviate a bit from that format, it's okay. If the speaker wants to take some questions during the presentation, that's also okay. And you can obviously use the chat option as well if you want to ask questions to everyone. Clarifying questions or even discussion questions to keep for later. All right, so Cevat, back to you. Thanks. Cevat?
I guess there are audio difficulties there.
All right, so we're two minutes ahead of schedule, so we're okay. Cevat, are you back? I think he's having a problem with his connection. Cevat? Okay, so Javad is having an issue, so I will just share this session for now. So very happy to have Michael Clements as the first presenter, and then Alan Manning as a discussant. And then we have a second paper, which will be presented by Johannes Matzat on immigration and political ideologies. Michael is presenting new work on the fiscal effect of immigration. So Michael, if you want to share your slides, and the floor is yours, 20 minutes for you.
Thank you so much. Can you see my slides? Great. Thank you, Javad. Thank you, Pierre-Louis, for stepping in also, and for this invitation, and all of you for taking the time to be here. This is a simple little paper with a simple little idea. So think of it as like an aperitif for the real meal of the day, the real papers you're going to get for the next 2 days. It's about the fiscal effect of immigration. A long literature, to be very brief, suggests that perhaps quantitatively some of the largest economic effects on natives from immigrants arrive not simply within the labor market from competition in the labor market, but through fiscal redistribution, and quantitatively estimating what that impact is, particularly by different skill levels, is my subject here. In the broadest, bluntest possible terms, there are two approaches to estimating this quantity in the literature. The first and by far the most policy influential, I would even go as far to say it's the only strand of research that has a major impact on policy, is simply cash flow accounting. Count up taxes paid by immigrants, benefits received by immigrants, both of those broadly considered, and total up whether that you get a positive or a negative number. Are natives subsidizing immigrants or vice versa through this mechanism? And this is sometimes called the net direct fiscal contribution. This, it has many advantages. It yields estimates that are very precise and transparent. It's something that anybody can understand. It could be done at an instantaneous flow during a particular moment in time. It could be a net present value discounted cash flows for an immigrant. It could or could not include the next generation or even the next 2 generations. But fundamentally, what we're doing is cash flow accounting, offsetting the benefits of transparency and precision that give it such massive policy influence are clear biases in this method. We understand that we're omitting here many indirect effects that the arrival and the work of an immigrant could have on the economy by other channels, and therefore on fiscal revenue. And the other major strand of literature attempts to address these simply by modeling the whole economy, not just modeling the labor market, but also the goods market, the capital market, sometimes the land market, which has the major advantage of addressing some of these biases that we sense are present in cash flow accounting, but at a big cost to transparency and precision. The estimates, as Edo et al. Say, and many others reach the same conclusion, are sensitive to a wide variety of modeling choices. And this is why, for example, in the estimates that dominate policy discussion in the US, made by a panel of some of the leading economists studying immigration in 2017, convened by the National Academy of Sciences, they explicitly avoid equilibrium modeling in favor of estimating net direct fiscal contribution, and they describe that number as the fiscal effect of immigration. So the idea here is very, very simple. It's asking, is there a third method that would retain many of the benefits of simplicity, transparency, precision of cash flow accounting, while addressing some of the biggest or maybe the biggest bias inherent to the cash flow accounting method? And quite simply, it's to account for tax revenue from capital income that is caused by the labor of immigrants. So think of this immigrant a grocery worker in the United States, born in Venezuela. If we were to use the cash flow accounting method to account for her net fiscal contribution, we would ask, well, how much is she paying in taxes on her labor? She might get some capital income, but a worker of this kind is very unlikely to get a large share of her income from capital. So to a first approximation, the tax revenue that local state and federal government is receiving is off her labor income. And then count up in a broad sense how many benefits she receives, both in terms of transfers and in terms of public services provided caused by her presence in the economy. There's something missing here, which is in this picture. Her work, the existence of her job, her employment presupposes the existence of all kinds of capital. She couldn't be doing it without the scanning machine, without the credit card reader, without the counter, without the lighting, without the shelves, without the building that you see in this picture, and many other things you don't see, such as the marginal truck needed to bring in the marginal vegetables to the grocery store that are being sold here. And all that capital exists because somebody could make money by investing in that capital. The money that they are making is being taxed, and that's not incidental to the fiscal calculation. In fact, in calculating her net fiscal contribution, counting only the tax revenue off her labor income, we're making an implicit assumption, which is that all of the people who invested in all of the capital you see, which again is necessary to her work, did so as an act of charity. Not that they're making any additional money off that capital that is taxed, but simply because they either it wasn't taxed or they didn't earn any, and that's an odd assumption, and I think we can relax that without much loss of transparency. So just to fix ideas, think of a representative firm that makes an output Y by combining in some way capital and labor. Without loss of generality, set the total factor productivity parameter equal to 1 by choosing units on Y. The product exhaustion rule, also known as zero economic profit condition, just says that all output pays either labor or capital. And we can take the derivative with respect to L to ask the total derivative, notice, not the partial derivative, and ask, well, when an additional unit of labor is added to the economy, what happens to production? Stepping back from fiscal revenue, what happens to production in the economy? Well, it goes up by the wage, but not just by the wage. It needs to go up by an additional amount necessary to compensate the owners of the capital for the capital that this worker is using in production at the margin to compensate owners of that capital for not investing it in a reservation asset, plus in parentheses general equilibrium effects. If the addition of this unit of labor changes the price of labor or the price of capital. Now, like the cash flow accounting method, we can just set aside general equilibrium effects, assume that that parenthetical term to be 0. The capital labor ratio is fixed by the capital share of income alpha and the price of labor and capital in competitive input markets. Plugging that last equation into the one above it, get a really simple expression for the change of output when you add a worker to an economy. It's the wage plus an additional factor, which is the amount necessary to compensate owners of capital for the capital that worker uses, plus a term for general equilibrium effects, with those etas representing the own price and cross price elasticity of labor. Now, notice that if like in the cash flow accounting method, we're willing to assume that general equilibrium effects are 0, and we're just looking at static. The production goes up by more than the wage, and I think that's intuitively obvious, but it's useful just to get a simple expression for it, because it helps us look now at the tax bill. So here, let's define the total tax revenue as a marginal tax rate on labor times the wage minus benefits received by labor, all of that times the quantity of labor being employed. Similar terms for capital, marginal tax rate on capital times the price of capital minus benefits received by capital times the quantity of capital employed, and take the total derivative of this with respect to labor, with a couple of simplifying assumptions, like the addition of an immigrant worker doesn't cause the government to be more or less willing to subsidize capital, which I think is pretty innocuous. You get a very simple expression analogous to the expression you saw for production on the previous page. I'll start from the right-hand side of this just because it's easier to read that way. The effect of the addition of a worker on net tax revenue is at the far right, negative the benefits they receive, the tax revenue received from their labor, marginal effective rate of taxation on labor times the wage, times a multiplier, and in parentheses, and it's 1 plus the amount collected from tax revenue on the capital that laborer is working with. There's that multiplier that you saw times the ratio of the effective rate of capital taxation to the effective rate of labor taxation. Really simple. And this makes transparent what's going on in the cash flow accounting method. If we're willing to assume that employers are employing workers as an act of charity, they don't actually get any capital income from that, or that is alpha is 0, or the effective rate of capital taxation, the effective rate of taxation on capital is 0, we get the cash flow accounting method, which is just count up the taxes paid on labor by that grocery worker, subtract the benefits she receives, and that's the impact on taxation. If we're not willing to assume that, then we can make some pretty simple and transparent estimates of what the actual tax revenue is, rough, but I would argue much less biased than the cash flow accounting method. And you can see the 3 elements that we need here. We need an estimate on the far right, we need benefits received and taxes paid on labor income. And for those, I'm going to use the National Academy of Sciences estimates for the United States at different skill levels. We need an estimate of the capital share of income, which has been extensively studied in the economic literature. And we need, that's alpha, and we need an estimate of the ratio of the effective rate of taxation on capital to labor. And for that last one, I'm just going to use directly the estimates of Saez and Zuckman, which, to make a long story short, that ratio they estimate is roughly unity in the United States right now. And I want to clarify that this is the effective rate of taxation on those. It is the dollars of actual taxes received per dollar of capital income to actual tax dollars of taxes received on labor income per dollar of labor income. That is about 1.06 during the period of time analyzed by the National Academy of Sciences. As for the capital share, or 1 minus the labor share, that's been roughly 0.6 in the United States since World War II. There's been a lot of literature about that recent decline, but to first approximation, it's not a terrible approximation to say this ratio has been roughly constant over time. It's about 0.6 right now. Put differently, this is just alpha over 1 minus alpha, the dollars of capital income per dollar of labor income. That's been 0.6 or more for much of history, and right now it's between 0.7 and 0.8. It's the taxation on that income that is missing from the cash flow accounting method, and that has always puzzled me. One thing we have to do when using estimates like the National Academy of Sciences cash flow accounting methods is take out a few things to make sure we're not double counting. Direct taxes paid on capital income, which for the primary skill group of interest, less than high school, is really quite low. Here I'm estimating from CPS data in the United States that's roughly 2% for the average recent immigrant with less than a high school degree. We also have to take out excise taxes paid on income from capital. That including them would be double counting, and we especially have to take out property taxes. In a brief presentation like this, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those because especially for the group of principal interest less than high school, as you can imagine, they're quite small. So here, I'll just report, these are not my analysis, this is copy and paste of the National Academy of Sciences estimates of the net direct fiscal contribution, pure cash flow accounting method for different skill groups in the United States. This is a 75-year net present value of tax flows and benefits flows by skill group. I'll just focus on the first row and the left-hand side, which is immigrants only, not including descendants. They estimate net present value discounted at 3% of $272,000 per immigrant with less than a high school degree, per recent immigrant with less than a high school degree over essentially a lifetime, and $381,000 in benefits received. And this is really a very, very, very comprehensive measure of benefits, not just welfare and food assistance, but things like emergency room bills, incarceration, costs of additional community policing, an extraordinarily comprehensive measure of benefits. And they get a large negative number of negative $109,000 per immigrant subsidy of immigrants by natives, and also a very, very steep skill gradient. You can see between high school only and bachelor's degree, the net direct fiscal contribution goes up by a factor of 30. Really, really extremely a steep gradient. So what if we do the correction in the equation I presented earlier? This theta, phi, and SL in the middle relate to the assumptions about, in the case of phi, the portion of the tax revenue reported by the National Academy of Sciences that comes from either direct or indirect taxes paid on capital income, which again for less than high school is really quite small, under 2% in this case. The rest is about property taxes that not going to go into detail, but it's only a portion of property taxes paid by these groups ends up being double counting in the estimates. Those are roughly 2% and 3% respectively of the tax revenue estimated by National Academy of Sciences. So I'm not going to spend time on them here. What it really depends on is assumptions, as you might imagine, about the capital share of income. Assuming the actual capital share of income for the period under study, which is 2011 to 2013, that's what the National Academy of Sciences is studying, then we can correct the estimates, the preceding slides estimates of the National Academy of Sciences, first by taking out any taxes paid on capital or property that would be double counting to get the taxes paid on labor income only for less than high school. That's 253,000. Meaning that accounting for taxes paid on the capital share of income, we get up to 470, and as you can see, that gives that actually flips the sign of the net direct fiscal contribution. Heavily dependent.
Warning.
Yes, thank you. Heavily dependent on the on assumptions about the labor share. So this is for each educational group. On the vertical axis, the present value fiscal impact per immigrant that you get, depending on what you assume about the labor share. Again, the currently policy dominant discussion of the cash flow accounting method is assuming a labor share of 1. It's not accounting for any taxation of capital income that is caused by the presence of that worker in the economy. And you can read off the National Academy of Sciences estimates along the right side of that graph. If you were to use the actual figure estimated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics for the same years of 0.564 labor share, you get the numbers in the table you just saw. For example, a subsidy, lifetime subsidy, present value of $89,000 subsidy of existing taxpayers by the marginal recent US immigrant with less than a high school degree. In the paper, I talk about many of the assumptions underlying what you just saw. Is there systematic displacement from employment of natives by immigrants? 3 different meta-analyses find that effect centers on 0. I don't think that's an unreasonable assumption. Maybe the most simplifying assumption, what you just saw, was heterogeneous labor. Here, if you're interested in this, I refer you to a really fascinating recent paper by Mark Colas and Dominique Sachs, exploring in a very complementary way what happens if we relax that assumption in a model of this kind. It turns out that these estimates are actually conservative. I've assumed that the labor share and corresponding capital share for firms that employ immigrants are similar to firms in the rest of the economy, and I test that in the paper. For example, is it the case that immigrants tend to be systematically employed in sectors with higher or lower capital shares in the U.S. economy? In fact, capital share is slightly higher in sectors that employ immigrants, not lower. And I also leave out political economy effects, studied among others by Stephanie Sancheva and the unfortunately late and great Alberto Alesina, who find that the presence of immigrants could decrease the willingness of voters to redistribute through the tax system, to the extent that they decrease the willingness to pay out benefits without decreasing the willingness to be taxed, that would be a further reason that these estimates are conservative. I think it's time for me to wrap up, but if I have 1 minute, I just want to reflect on why people haven't discussed this particular channel before. It's certainly not because the smartest people in the world haven't been looking at this. I really think it's just the tradition of tax scoring in public economics. If we were considering a different change in fiscal policy, the same equation for capital T that you saw before, but let's say the total derivative with respect to the tax rate, there would be only two kinds of terms here: the direct effect, that WL, plus general equilibrium effects. And this is where all the debates about the Laffer curve come from. There is no analogy in the tradition of tax scoring analysis to the third term that we're looking at here, the omitted capital revenue. And it's because when we're asking what the fiscal effect of immigration is, we're not asking once an immigrant is present in the economy, what is the degree of redistribution? Explicitly in the economics literature, these estimates are used in recommending governments whether or not to allow this person to exist in the economy. And when this person exists in the economy and is employed in the economy, that has large effects on tax revenue through capital income that are almost entirely omitted from existing estimates. And I really want to thank profoundly in advance Alan Manning for looking at this work if I don't get a chance to do it later. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Michael. We'll go straight to the discussion. Alan Manning. You want to unmute?
Yeah. And can you see my screen here? Is that good?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. Oops. Okay. So basically, as with all of Michael's work, this is an incredibly interesting and thought-provoking paper. And I think the way I think of it is that it really says that if we're going to assume that there are no wage or factor price effects from immigration, to have a logically coherent model, you have to really assume that capital is going to respond to immigration, and that is enough. That effect is enough to flip the net fiscal impact of low-skilled migrants from negative to positive. And as Michael said, that's really important, because when we come particularly to lower skilled migration, one of the major issues, bones of contention, is the net fiscal impact. Now, I'm going to make sort of basically three comments. The first is I'm going to put forward an alternative sort of defense of the accounting approach, which argues that it's not really that it ignores wage changes because they don't exist. It's because they're actually not necessarily very relevant. I'm also secondly going to talk about, although Michael says, well, we need to think about the demand for capital of employers, I'm slightly concerned that in doing so, we're essentially introducing a slightly uncomfortable assumption on the supply of capital that we might not want to do. And then finally, I just want to make the point that really, I think when we come to talk about immigration, particularly of low-skilled workers, one's got to be very precise about exactly what are the conditions under which that immigration takes place, because that is likely to make a lot of difference. So first of all, this is just a sort of very simple alternative defense of the accounting approach, which is, let's just assume for simplicity that all factors, labor, capital, are in inelastic supply, and that income from all factors has the same marginal tax rate. And actually, in Michael's assumption, that's pretty much where he was. So then we can just assume that the total tax revenue is going to be the tax rate tau times total output. And then we get the change from more unskilled migration is just tau times the marginal product of the unskilled migrant, which is assumed to be their wage. And we don't have to worry about changes in wages or returns to capital at all, because those are just things redistribution. And so if the marginal tax rate on all sorts of income is exactly the same, it doesn't really matter if you have a bit more lower wages and a bit higher return to capital, because the tax take is going to be exactly the same on that. So that basically says that you can ignore factor price changes, You know, you're not really assuming there are none, it's just that it doesn't really matter. But of course, as Michael points out, there are reasons to think that the employment of capital by employers will go up if there's low skill migration and there are no changes in factor prices. But of course, assuming that there are no changes in factor prices is essentially assuming that the supply of capital in an economy is infinitely elastic. And, you know, there are different ways you could justify that migrants bring their own capital, but then as Michael showed, they don't bring that much. You could assume that there's sort of global capital markets. That was often one justification, but you've got to be careful on this because you've got to make sure that if it's foreign capital owners who are doing the extra investment, that they're actually paying US tax on that capital. But I think really the assumption really is that this of infinitely elastic supply is assuming that domestic households adjust their spending and saving decisions, even though they have no change in income. And it's not really clear to me that any particular model of savings behavior that we have would really support this particular assumption. So although I do have some sympathy for Michael's argument that the accounting approach doesn't really make much sense from the employer side, I worry slightly we've replaced it with something that doesn't make much sense from the household side. And the underlying problem here is there's an inherent tension between the accounting approach and economic models. And we're just not really, you know, seeking to join the two things up just doesn't really work. There's going to be some uncomfortable assumption somewhere along the line. Okay, final point, critical role of details about immigration. So if we think about redistribution, our systems of redistribution, we redistribute on over the life cycle for an individual, and we have social insurance as well. That, you know, we have good times, we have bad times, and you know, and redistribution helps us through that. But most systems are not actuarially fair for everyone. And basically, so some people do have a negative net lifetime fiscal contribution, and those people tend to be people with you know, have low lifetime earnings. And, you know, because we would expect lower skill migrants to be often among the lowest earners in economies, we might expect lower skill migrants actually to end up as net recipients of, you know, so to have a negative net fiscal contribution. But the terms under which low skill migrants are admitted are going to be really important about that. And, you know, just to give some examples of that. So if you think about the Gulf economies, lots and lots of low skilled migrants, they're all temporary, they have to work, they have not allowed to have dependents, they have no access to welfare benefits. I'm pretty sure the fiscal impact of them is going to be positive. There are other costs. It's a very much a two-tier, you know, society, you know, but, you know, there are arguments for that. Let's go to another extreme. Say Norway. So if you look at the papers by Bratsberg and co-authors that follow cohorts of low-skilled labour migrants and their children who came in 1970, although they don't compute the fiscal impacts, when you look at what they look at about the employment rates, the earnings, including for their children, and what you know about the Norwegian welfare state, be very surprised if the impact of those low-skilled migrants hadn't been negative in that context. In the UK, where, you know, we've had some studies in recent years that kind of look at this, and I should say that those studies do include an induced impact on property and profits taxation. So actually do go some of the way towards what Michael wants, although I'm not sure they go the full way, actually. You know, those studies suggest that if we're talking about, you know, take a young single worker, their fiscal impact becomes positive if they earn, you know, £10,000 a year. That's a very low, you know, that's a very low level. But if you get a family of four, that's 45,000 is the break even. So it matters an awful lot whether you're going to have low skilled workers coming in. Are they allowed to have dependents? Are they going to be eligible for welfare benefits? Are they, you know, what kind of things are going to go, are we going to do on, going to have there? And, you know, I think if you can make sure that lower skilled migrants actually always work and don't have that much in the way of non-working dependents, you can make the net fiscal impact positive. but you have a society then in which you have a rather second-class set of citizens. Well, they're not citizens, I mean, second-class set of residents. And, you know, there are other costs that come with that. So I'll just stop there.
Thanks a lot. Before I give Michael a chance to answer, I'd like to take 2 or 3 questions from the audience, if that's okay with you.
Yes.
To ask a question, you can just use the raise your hand function. All right, it's the beginning, so we have to warm up a bit.
I could also start with Alan if that would give people a chance to think.
Okay, go ahead.
I just want to thank you profoundly, Alan. The problem with having a discussion like Alan Manning is that the comments are more substantive than the paper itself. About the first and third point, I just couldn't agree more. The first point was a defense of omitting general equilibrium effects from the cash flow accounting method, which is an assumption that I retain, and I think I just agree with everything he said. The third point was fundamentally that the fiscal effect of immigration depends on the fiscal system and regulations in the labor market, and it is not really some sort of fixed impact of admitting or not admitting a person. That's my interpretation. That's my subjective summary of the comment, and I think it's something which is the appreciation of which would really enrich a policy discussion, and is absolutely correct. About the second point about where is accumulating capital coming from, that's a really profound comment, and I need to revise around that. I do want to point out that there's an additional channel for capital accumulation that wasn't mentioned, which is simply allowing for foresight. If in fact I know in advance that there is a reliable stream of immigrants coming into the country, which to a first approximation in the United States, it's certainly the case that the arrival of a large number of low-skill immigrants is not any kind of a surprise, then I would have priced that into my saving and investment behavior from the very beginning. And the availability of capital to complement that labor in any given year would not need to arise from a frictionless global capital market. It could simply arise from the fact that that my entire life cycle of saving and investing takes into account a predictable inflow of immigrants, such that when they arrive, the capital has been accumulated and is ready to invest. And it is precisely on the income from the investment of that capital that I think some of these large emitted tax revenue flows arise. But the bigger point of modeling household behavior and accounting for the existence of this capital, which we can see with our eyes, but we need to understand economically where it comes from, is a really profound comment, like all of them, that will really improve this paper. And I'm just very, very grateful to Alan.
Are there any questions or comments from the audience? Alan, do you want to reply again to Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting. I sort of half agree with him, but I'm not sure I fully agree with him, because, you know, if one thinks that what one is really proposing is not the immigration of one lower skilled worker, but a scheme which allows a certain number in every year. And so we're talking about really increasing the rate of growth of the labor force. I think that most of our models of growth and household savings would suggest that when we have higher labor force growth, we actually end up with a lower capital to labor ratio because we have to invest in capital widening as much as capital deepening, and also that the rate of return on capital goes up in order to induce the extra saving. So, I mean, I think I would kind of like to see it a bit more embedded in a sort of dynamic classic model, in which, you know, a classic sort of growth model in which we're really talking about something which is a flow of workers rather than just one single individual.
A really superb comment and very much appreciated. Thank you.
There's a question in the chat. I can read it for you if that's easier. if you are studying refugees and asylum claimants, would the bias in the net direct fiscal contributions be worse?
Thank you. So that's something I've studied a bit in a forthcoming paper in the Oxford Review of Economics and of Economic Policy. It depends very, very heavily, as you might imagine, on the country. In the United States, the net direct fiscal contribution of refugees has been estimated, and it is larger than the net direct fiscal contribution of average immigrants to the United States. Why? Because refugees tend to be actually have higher education and better labor market integration than average non-refugee immigrants to the United States. In Europe, of course, where the terminology that many of you use seems to be somewhat different in describing asylum seekers and refugees, and they're often put together into the same bin. There's the net direct fiscal contribution, especially in particular countries, seems to be more negative for asylum seekers and refugees than for average immigrants, and that seems to hinge critically on labor force participation, which in some countries remains low for asylum seekers and refugees relative to other immigrants for many, many years after arrival. So I've seen detailed estimates of that for resettled refugees and asylees, not asylum seekers, in the United States. I have not seen a typical European calculation of the same numbers, but I would expect it to be worse. I would point out that here is absolutely crucial, Alan Manning's last point, which is that the net direct fiscal contribution of asylum seekers and asylees depends absolutely critically on other aspects of fiscal policy and other aspects of labor market policy, particularly explicit bans from working or discouragements from working, which have been shown by Marbach et al. And and other analysis in Europe to have a large impact on their fiscal contribution. So it would mistake the nature of the treatment that we are studying to think that the immigration or non-immigration of this person is what determines the fiscal impact, rather than the nature of the labor market regulations, particularly as they apply to asylum seekers, could be just far more influential quantitatively. And that's a very deep point that Alan makes, that everyone in this literature, and certainly every policymaker considering these discussions, needs to absorb.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much, Alan. We'll move straight to the next paper, which is presented by Johannes Matzat on immigration and the polarization of American politics. So Johannes, if you want to go ahead and share your screen.
Yes.
Right.
Wait. Let me unshare again. Quickly move screens. Right. Can you see my presentation? It's great. Okay. Thank you. So I'm very happy to present here. Thank you very much for having me. I'm presenting today a project is still rather on the early stage, so we were very happy to receive feedback, and it's on the polarizing effect of immigration. This joint work with Axel Dreher, Sarah Langlotz, Anna-Maria Maida, and Christopher Parson, and Axel and Chris are also in the audience today. So I think I don't have to point out here that we've seen a drastic increase in polarization in a number of countries around the world, and that's particularly pronounced in the United States. It's not only apparent among politicians in Congress, but also among the broader population. If we then think about what are the issues that people are getting especially polarized around, then it becomes clear that immigration is very much at the center of that. That's also something that Gianaioli and Tabellini have pointed out in a very neat new working paper, where they highlight that the polarization within society has shifted from the classical left-right divide between workers and elites more towards cultural issues, among which immigration is one central issue. So motivated by these facts, we think that it would be very interesting to study the influence of immigration, polarization, and political ideologies. And we do so by looking at a panel of counties that covers the 1992 to 2016 period, and we focus on the House of Representatives, which is the lower chamber of Congress. We will look at immigration flows and refugee inflows and consider political ideology and polarization. And for now, all our ideology and polarization measures will be based on campaign contribution data. In the future, we also plan to extend that to survey data and Twitter data. What do we contribute to the literature? First, I want to point out, like, we explicitly take into account that parties change their position in especially in response to external shocks or swings in the mood of the electorate. Parties will adapt their position, something which is pointed out by political science literature, right? And if you capture like right leftward shift by vote shares, which has been done quite extensively, then you can miss these adaptations by parties. Then on top, if you want to study polarization, it's especially important to get ideology estimates first, especially so in a two-party system like the United States. Yeah, we're then also considering not only like all immigrants, but we also look at refugees specifically, as it's not clear a priori whether you would expect the same effect or something, or a dissimilar effect, as the selection mechanism is very different, and as the moral argument to accept one or the other group also differs a lot. We're then aiming to step into the mechanisms a little bit more, but we only started that here. We're also very happy to have some new data which we explore. On the one hand side, we got vast refugee data covering the universe of refugees since 1975, and it comes with very precise geographic information, so that we were able to geocode it down to the city level. As I said, we exploit also vast campaign contribution data, and a lot of that data, the information in these data sets is still very unsystematic and hasn't been harmonized and standardized, and so we also work on that extensively at the moment, and we are hopeful that also others will find it useful. And before I now come to the empirical part, I want to quickly highlight how we think about the relation between immigration and polarization. There are two very prominent social psychology literatures, which we use as a starting point. So on the one hand side, there's group threat theory, which argues if there's some sort of competition around scarce resources involved, then like between like members of an in and out group, it can easily evolve in the in-group feeling threatened or outcompeted by the out-group. However, then as has been pointed out by context, like opponents, like followers of the contact theory, they point out that being in contact or like in some sort of meaningful contact can actually lead to mutual understanding and empathy, and thus prevent these negative sentiments that can evolve. So what is then important to consider is under which circumstances and for which individuals, which of the two theories will dominate, right? And here it's very important to consider that that there's a lot of agencies of individuals involved when selecting into contact, right? Like an individual can decide to get into contact with members of the outgroups and can like expose themselves much more to situations where we'll get into meaningful contact with members of the other group. And therefore, we believe that the political impact of immigration will depend on prior beliefs, as liberal-minded individuals will get much more likely into contact with members of the out group, and thus can also benefit from the dynamics that are put forward by contact theory, as opposed to individuals with anti-immigrant sentiments. And then an additional hypothesized effect will come from the competition side, right? As group threat theory argues that the more competition there is the more easily natives can feel threatened, we also expect that the backlash against immigration will increase in competition, and we will try to look at that a little bit on the labor market and the cultural sphere. Let me now come to the empirics. Where I want to quickly show you our data sources. So for the migration data, we use for immigration the classical sources like the census and community surveys. For refugees, we obtained new data from the Office of Refugee Resettlement and Bureau of Population, Refugee and Migration. This covers the universe of refugees. It's for large parts of the period at the individual level, and got this spatially very fine-grained, and we geocoded it down to the city level. And we're very, very happy to share a preliminary version with everyone. You can just send me an email. For the outcome side, as I said, we rely on campaign contribution data. These come originally from the Federal Election Commission and have been provided to us by Adam Bonica, who calculates based on campaign contribution data ideology scores. And specifically, we use all campaign contributions flowing to candidates of the House of Representatives. For all of these politicians, we know the location, the ideology, and the votes they receive. And then we also have information about all the donors that give these campaign contributions, right? We know the location, the name, the occupation, and the employer. As ideology estimates are a fundamental piece in all our outcomes, I want to quickly highlight the validity of these scores to you. I don't want to go into technical details how Adam Bonica estimates them, as the time will not allow, but it's based on campaign contribution patterns, and he uses correspondence analysis. But importantly, what I want to show you is that the resulting ideology scores, they seem to be very valid on a number of dimensions. If you compare them to the gold standard that has been used before quite a lot, which is DW nominate, and which are ideology scores which are based on roll call votes in Congress, then you actually get a correlation of 0.92. The ideology scores from Adam Bonica also have very high predictive validity. If you want to predict how members in Congress vote, you get a correct classification of in 88% of the times. And it has also a very high predictive power for a number of policy items in a CCS survey. Let's now come to the outcomes. I want to quickly walk you through the different outcomes that we construct. First, we start here at the donor side, where we construct an outcome measuring the amount of extreme relative to moderate contributions that flow out of an area. In the future, we also want to go deeper into assessing which type of donor reacts to immigration inflows by differentiating by their occupation and the culture, which we hope to retrieve from their last names. We then move to the candidate sides to construct another set of outcomes, where we first look at the ideological distance between the winning candidate and the losing candidate within an area. And we then move on to capture left and rightward swings by looking at the ideology of the winner and the ideology of the most successful candidate by party, as well as the Republican vote share to link back to a related literature. As I said, in the future, we planned like further outcomes. First, we also want to construct polarization outcomes based on survey data, and then we aim to construct polarization within Twitter as well. Before I show you now the results, I want to quickly highlight our identification. At the moment, we use, I guess, the standard shifter instrument, where we instrument immigration flows by the 1980 share of immigrants living in a specific county interacted with the national level immigration flows by origin. We then follow a similar logic for the county population. And we make a number of the robustness checks that were suggested in the recent shifter literature, and yeah, we don't find any results that give concern that our identifying assumptions are not valid. However, we plan to improve those instruments a little bit more on the refugee side as well as on the immigration side. Let's now come to our outcomes, so to the results. So our main results for immigrants are shown here in a coefficient plot, where I plotted you our main coefficient of interest for a number of specifications. When you focus on the top row, you see a polarization measure measuring the amount of extreme relative to moderate contributions, and we see that an inflow of immigrants increases polarization in campaign contributions considerably. If you then focus on our second polarization measure, the ideological distance between the winning and the losing candidate, we get a quite large but not significant point estimate. So there might be some polarization also within candidates in the short run. We're not able to see that because our standard errors are so large. However, if we move to the medium run, this coefficient gets significant. If we then focus on left and rightward shift, first looking at the average ideology of the winner, we find also a sizable rightward shift, which is interestingly not only driven by an increase in Republican vote shares. So it's not only driven by more Republicans winning, but it's also driven by winning Republicans becoming more right. If we look at winning Democrats, we don't see a similar rightward shift. And this pattern is also reflected if you look at the likelihood of a conservative Republican winning. We then have
5 minutes.
Thank you. We then have a set of alternative outcomes. Where we repeat the whole exercise for refugees. We look at polarization as well. We look at the rightward shifts as well, and we find very similar results, as well as in magnitude and direction. Maybe to give you a quick sense about magnitudes here as well, as that's always interesting. If you look at the standard increase in our immigration flows, so from the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile in our sample, you get an increase of 5 percentage points in the Republican vote shares, and the likelihood that a conservative Republican wins increases by 10%. As I said, we also look at the medium run. When the previous results were differences between 2 years. If we then now move to differences of 8 years, we also find polarization tendencies, but here we don't find any significant effects for immigrants in polarizing campaign contributions, but we do find the effect for polarization between candidates. If we look at the left and rightward shift, we see the same patterns. We then also constructed some interaction terms based on the notion, right, that an increasing competition potentially increases the backlash against immigrants. Here we focused on 2 spheres, education and culture. And specifically, we compared the educational composition of new arrivals with the educational composition of residents. Right, and if they are very similar, we would suspect that they're much more likely to be in direct competition on the labor market, and thus would expect a larger backlash. And this is also indeed what we find. The more similar the educational composition are within those 2 groups, the larger is the backlash. On the cultural sphere, we repeat the exercise. We compare the origins. Compare the origins of the new arrivals and the residents based on the notion that new arrivals will bring their norms and values with them and will create some sort of competition around the prevailing norms and values within an area. And the further away the norms and values are from those of the residents' population, the more costly will it be to lose that competition. And so the higher the stakes are. Right, and so therefore here we would expect the more dissimilar the composition is in cultural background, the higher will be the backlash. And this is also again what we find here. As I said, right, we executed a number of robustness checks, right? We checked for spurious trends, we checked for pre-trend serial correlation, and we also randomized immigration shares across counties within the same year, across years within the same county, and across years and counties. But none of those checks provides any evidence that our identifying assumptions are not valid. So let me then conclude. We looked at the polarizing effect of immigration, and we also looked at political ideologies. We did so by introducing new refugee data, and we exploited and harmonized like rich ideology data based on campaign contributions. And what we find is a polarizing effect of immigration as well as refugees in campaign contributions. And we found also a polarizing effect when we look at the ideological distance between candidates. In addition, we find a rightward shift within candidates. So, for example, an increase in the Conservative Republic, the probability that the Conservative Republican wins. And this increase is more pronounced if the cultural composition is more dissimilar and the educational composition is more similar. With that, I'm at the end, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Johannes. We'll move straight to the discussion by Liana.
Okay.
7 minutes.
Can you see the slides? Good. So thank you so much for letting me be the discussant of this fascinating paper. I really enjoyed reading it. Just a side note that I come from political science, so I read it with a political science eye, which might be helpful for you guys or which might be less helpful for you guys. So take selectively what I'm saying. So to summarize the paper, so we're looking at a very interesting question: how migrant inflows to the US affect political polarization. And we're looking at both what campaign donors, what they are donating for, and how politicians fare. So it has a long time period between 1992 and 2016, which is impressive. Also impressive is the massive sample, 60 million campaign finance contributions, as well as the universe of migrants. And we get clear results. Migrant inflows increase polarization in both donors and elected politicians, but this fades away with time. Now, overall, I see some big contributions in this paper to what we know. And the first one is, which you already identified in your presentation, which for the political science crew is a big deal, is that we're not relying on party labels here, Democrats versus Republicans, but we're actually trying to dig in to the ideology and the shifts of the ideology, for which you use this data on ideologies and money in electoral campaigns. Also, what is interesting is the long time span. So you get to see a bit how long-standing these shifts are. And it's interesting to see that they tend to fade away in the long run. That is really cool to see. So it's not like, okay, it increases polarization, but maybe it's not there for very long. And then what is also very cool is the explicit differentiation between immigrants and refugees. That is very welcome in the literature that tends to either focus on immigration and then extend it to refugees or vice versa. It's a really neat distinction that really I applaud that. And also an angle of the paper that I don't think you really sell or you could emphasize more is that it's elite level data, which it really hasn't been done. And that was really, really interesting. And it helps us to understand the polarization process of politics from a larger perspective than just casting votes for Republicans or Democrats. Okay, so that is very cool. So about the empirics quickly, so a shift share instrument with the intuition of a difference in differences. So basically the question is how changes in foreign populations over time differentially affect counties with varying shares of immigrants in 1980. Now, much has been written about the pitfalls of the Bartik shift share instrument, and you very well check for the pitfalls that might come. So I think it's empirically all very sound. However, there was one aspect in which I was left a bit wondering about possible spillover effects between counties. So how can we be sure that the measurements are county specific and one county's shocks are not spilling over to another county? I get that the outcome is well, you run for the House in a specific county, so that is clear. But how are these shocks to the labor market competition in one county not spilling over to the neighboring county is something that I was wondering a bit. Can you check for that in any ways that these are indeed county specific? So one big theme that came to my mind when I was reading this paper is that the big theoretical framework is that of contact and threat theories. So you assume that Democrats self-select to make contact with immigrants, whereas Republicans would opt out. So there's like this endogeneity in contact that it already stems from the political outlook. So, however, what I found a bit puzzling is that this seems to be an a priori expectation that doesn't really get measured. And I was really happy to hear that you intend to follow up with a survey, because I would love to hear whether this actually happens. So this seems to rely on the assumption that this is what's going on. But we don't really get empirical measures of the nature and the extent of the contact that's going on. So if you wish to elaborate this framework more, then, for example, there is in the political science literature a paper by Homola and Tavits that also argues that context theory works, but it actually only works for people with leftist sympathies. So there is a room to expand that theoretical argument. But on the other hand, now there's a bit of a mismatch that it's a leading kind of theoretical framework in the paper, which doesn't really get matched in the empirics. So I'd love to see more work on that. And that is also really, really relevant, because lots of immigration papers assume if they get a positive effect in the exposure to asylum seekers or immigrants, that it must be contact, but it's kind of done in the absence of any empirical ground for that. However, the threat theory part was more convincing with the education levels you are able to measure, and that is something that I miss seeing in the contact discussion. So as I already said, the big contribution is the elite approach, and you could emphasize that more. We're getting some new light on how elites formulate their stances. Also, what I would be interested in reading about more, and maybe it's just not knowing the American political system so closely, is that are contributors really buying the candidates with their contributions, or do they have some options of just taking the money and just not delivering for them? So your strategy, your outcome kind of relies on the assumption that contributors will fund candidates that agree with them or will deliver those kind of policies that will benefit the contributors. But is this really happening? So that's also something that I'd love to follow up in a survey. Like, do you expect to really deliver to your anti-immigration funders, for example? So for the time being, we know very little, and I'm saying this because we know very little about the formation of elite level ideologies. So that is something I'd like to hear more about. And in so doing, actually, you might find useful to cite a recent paper by Katarina Jensen, who researches who runs for office in the wake of immigration shocks. So she finds that candidates with a background in a more working class tend to end up running for elections after immigration shocks in Denmark. So the composition of the candidate is already affected, not just the ideologies as you find, but maybe it's already like who runs is already something that is dictated by these shocks. But those were my remarks. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion. I already saw some questions in the Zoom panel. So I'm sure this will evoke lots of interesting comments. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So let's take a couple of questions from the audience. You can raise your hand. Confident, you can unmic, unmute, and go ahead. There's two questions from the chat. One of them by Jean-Francois. If you consider term limits at the county level in the US. Another question.
I was just wondering if I can, Pierre-Louis. So I don't know whether there is term limits, but whether you can see whether the incumbent, which is in the first mandate and seek for re-election, whether you would get some heterogeneity there, because to some extent it cannot deviate too much in terms of ideology from what he did in the past, right? So maybe there is some constraint here.
There's another question from Ahmad. Ahmad, are you here?
Yes. So I don't know, I might have missed this. You might have already told in the presentation, but I was wondering what determines migrants' decision to choose to live in a place where they live. So that sort of selection bias, a concern over selection bias by the immigrants.
Is there any other question? No, Johannes, if you want to, oh, sorry, Madeline.
I was just wondering if Johannes could explain more what being conservative means, because during this long period examined, what we think of as conservative in the US has really changed, perhaps from a Reagan type model to compassionate conservative to moral majority to Trumpism. And so what is it?
Okay, and we'll take one more question from Alexander.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Johannes. Just two brief clarifying questions. Do you think one could expect for some sort of post-treatment sorting of people based on ideology? So basically, that people move around responding to immigration inflows, if there are ways to, or refugees, if there are ways to measure that. And second, if there is a way maybe to use some social network data to look at, some sort of pre-existing connectivity of people with immigrants and generally different interactions across ancestries and like with immigrants and natives, and whether this can affect your results. So it's just basically like a heterogeneity treatment effect question, I guess. Thank you.
Okay, Johannes, after you.
Thank you very much for all those questions. And thank you especially Ilona Ladema for all your great comments and a great discussion. We really appreciate it. Right. So you asked a lot. Thanks a lot for everything. And yes, we agree, Ilona, with you. Yeah, it's we think it's very important to differentiate between ideology and party labels. And we're also happy to differentiate between immigrants and refugees, although we get, interestingly, very similar results. I think you're right. I think that we are at the moment we are capturing, or we are looking especially at elites by looking at campaign contributions. And I think with the survey, we want to move a little bit more to the general population so that we get a more representative picture, and then we could have, because ideally we want to kind of get a sense how this affects like all levels. And you're absolutely right that we do not directly measure whether a person gets into contact with a refugee and like whether that differs by their prior beliefs. That is, of course, our explanation of the patterns that we see. I think where we can move to, and I think what is very interesting is we can, as we have data on millions of donors. We do know how they behaved before like large immigration inflows in the area and how they behave afterwards, right? And then we can also at the individual level whether a liberal person or a person who contributed to liberal candidates behaves very differently than to a person who does not, is not liberal. However, we still wouldn't know like where they get in contact, right? But I think that's like kind of the closest where we get and where we can trace out like separately for individuals and conservatives at the individual level how things evolve. And I think then we would get already quite far. I think it was a very interesting suggestion to suggest that to assess whether contributors actually get what they kind of pay for. This is actually something we considered. We are not yet sure whether we want to go deeper into that. So something you could, for example, to assess, which is by looking at their behavior like later on, right? In their voting behavior in Congress, you can look at their speeches and then you could see which topics they address, right? And how they address them. And then you could easily kind of see whether they actually buy anti-immigrant kind of candidates, which are focusing very much on that dimension within the ideological sphere, or whether they are just in general more conservative or liberal. Yeah, I find that the suggestion regarding the term limits is, of course, very relevant in that regard, that if you think about ideology, you're very right that a person that, like any politicians, like their ideology will not shift like drastically, right? It's like you don't observe someone being very conservative to becoming suddenly very moderate. This just doesn't happen. It also doesn't happen in our data. So movements at the individual level of a politician are only like small. They shift slowly in one direction. So any big shifts you observe in our data and also big shifts that you then observe in our outcomes will always be generated by a change in the candidate, right? So a moderate candidate will be swept out by a more conservative candidate. And this is where the main variation comes from that we get actually in our outcomes.
If you want to conclude in 1 minute or.
Yes, I think most importantly, I want to thank you all. It has been a pleasure to be here. And I noted everything down and we're really happy to get your feedback. And yes, I'm looking forward to all other presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Johannes. You can check the chat. There's an additional question that you can get in touch with the question in private after. So we'll take a 10-minute break now. Thank you very much to the presenters and the discussants. And in 10 minutes, we start with the second session on migrants and firms. So at 3 p.m. London time. So thanks everyone again for the first session and see you in a bit.
No?
Hi, Shamal, how are you?
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Would you like to share your screen before we get started? Okay, great. So hi, everyone. Welcome back and welcome to the second session of the workshop. So this session will be on migrants and firms. We have 3 great papers and we have 3 great discussants in this session. So I would like to personally thank Danny, Sarah, and Steve for agreeing to discuss these papers. We know that it takes a lot of time to prepare thorough discussions and as well as the discussion slides. So very much appreciated. So rules of the game, they are still the same. We have 20 minutes for presentation, 7 minutes for our discussants, and then 8 minutes for Q&A. If you have any clarification questions during the presentation, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your questions directly. Otherwise, if you have more thorough or detailed questions about identification or framing or other questions, please wait until the end. Let's get started. So Shumel, floor is yours. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming and thank you for the organizers for having us. So today I'm going to present a joint work with Chaim Bover from Yale. In this project, we study the importance of films in the labor market assimilation of immigrants. So we all know since AKM 1998 paper that films are important for many aspects of the labor market, for example, for the distribution of wages. So in this paper, we study how much of the gaps between native and immigrants and the dynamics of these gaps and the assimilation of the gap can be explained by access to different type of films. Okay, so we study both pay and non-pay aspects of the job. So starting with the pay, we know that over the life cycle, people are climbing the ladder of good paying jobs. So, and a potential mechanism for the gap between native and immigrants in the ability to find a good job might be lack of social networks. So almost by the immigrants that arrive into a new country, especially if the immigration were surprised and unexpected, like in the case that we're going to talk today, arrive without a lot of social networks. So that might explain why they are not able to find a good job when they arrived into the new country. And it also might explain why the dynamics, why the gap is closing, if it closes, as I'm going to show you in this case, because over time they can build better and better social networks. Another potential mechanism for difference in the ability to find good jobs might be regulation. So in many countries, we know that immigrants are restricted in the sense of they're not able to work in each field they want. For example, in the US, some visas require the immigrants to work for the same field that issues a visa for them. So that might be another reason why immigrants are more restricted in finding better jobs. In 1 or 2 slides, I'm going to show that this is not the case in the context that we study. We also studied non-pay aspects of the jobs. So we know that jobs are different in many other aspects, such as amenities or the benefits that they provide. So we also check the assimilation in non-pay film characteristics. So there is large evidence on the importance of films in the labor market and also in the assimilation of immigrants. And here we combine the two together. So what we do in this paper, we study the role of heterogeneous films in labor market assimilation of immigrants. We use a massive empirical wave of immigration. So in the 90s, almost 1 million former Soviet Union Jews moved to Israel. As I said, Israel accepted them without any restrictions, so they were free to move between jobs. So we can think about it as a case without regulation and to check how much of in this benchmark case where immigrants are free to move, how much of the assimilation or the catch-up between immigrants and natives can be explained by this mechanism. Another advantage of this unique setup is in terms of measurement. So, of course, if there is regulation about the ability of workers to work in different fields, part of them might work in undocumented way, but this is not the case here. So we have no reason to think that there should be differences in the whether immigrants and natives work in jobs that pay taxes. So we can observe them in the tax records. Okay, so we use the population employee data from Israel that spans the years from the 80s until today. In particular, we have good information about the place of birth of the immigrants and the year of arrival to Israel, so we don't need to use the tax data to try to calculate this variable. And we show the contribution of film heterogeneity to the labor market assimilation of immigrants, both in terms of that they're able to find jobs that pay higher film-specific pay premiums, and also in terms of the assimilation in non-pay film characteristics. So let me briefly summarize the findings. So we show that immigrants initially employed in segregated, young, small and low-paying firms compared to natives. For example, the first year after arrival, they work in firms that pay on average 10% lower wages, so 10 percentage points of the difference is explained by the access to low-paying firms. Likewise, 1 year after arrival, they work in much smaller firms, 3 times in factor of 3. But after 18 years, they close the gap and actually start to work in better paying firms compared to natives. The overall gap between immigrants and natives in our study is closest after 25 years. And we show that sorting into high and low paying firms explain big fraction of this gap. So if we compare the overall gap with the within film gap, so about a third of the gap is disappearing once you control for the film. Likewise, the difference in film specific pay premiums is, as I said, is about 10 to 12% of the overall wage gap. Okay, so let me briefly describe the historical context. So in 1999, the USSR relaxed the immigration restrictions, and Soviet Jews started to live massively. Israel accepted them without any restrictions and gave them citizenship at the first minute they arrived to Israel. So over the 10 years from 89 to 99, more than 800,000 former Soviet Union Jews migrated to Israel, which if we compare it to the population of Israel at that time, so it's with about 4.5 million, so it was about 20% of the entire population was this wave of immigration, so it was a very big shock. At the first 3 years, so about half of all of those immigrants arrived at the first 3 years. Okay, so here we can see the graph. So there was, before that was like a small wave of immigration in the 70s, but we study this episode of massive immigration during the 90s. Okay, so previous studies show that there was almost no negative effect on the wages of natives. On arrival, the immigrants, as I said, they got immediately citizenship and they got some benefits, and most important, they were able to work and to live wherever they want. Another interesting feature of the immigrants is that they were highly educated compared to the Israeli population, and that's why that is consistent with the fact that actually we see that after many years in Israel, actually they start to work in better paying things compared to the natives. Okay, so now let's describe the data. So we're going to use the tax records of the entire labor force of Israel, which is linked to the Israeli population history. So we have the demographics of the workers, and most important, we have the country of birth and the date of immigration to Israel. And the sample that we study that we're going to show you today consists of 100% of the immigrants and 25% of the natives in Israel. So let's start with some style facts. So we want to study how this large inflow of immigrants impact the number of new firms and how segregated they were in the labor market. So here we plot the number of new firms in each year. So we can see this big jump in the number of firms during the 90s, but later go back to the trend. So we can calculate the excess mass of new firms that we think is because of this wave of immigration. Here we plot the number of new immigrant firms. So we define them by the share of former Soviet Union employees that work in each one of those firms. So again, we see a jump during the 90s that gradually decrease afterwards. Okay, here we see that once arrival, they tend to work in younger firms, but this is decreasing over time. And finally, we see that they worked in firms that are segregated once they arrived, and then again, gradually the trend is that they go to work in like standard firms, not without many former Soviet Union workers. Okay, so now let's go to the main findings. So we want to study the importance of firms in earnings. So we start from an augmented AKM model. So we assume that the log wages is equal to consists of person fixed effect, a firm fixed effect. We also control for age and the calendar year. And we add to this standard AKM, we add term that capture the assimilation. So this capture how much of the cap is different as a function of the time since arrival to Israel. And we do it in, so let's start, here we compare immigrants to natives, and we do it with and without firm fixed effect. So we're going to plot the different coefficients of the time since arrival, once with the overall gap, so without controlling for the firms, and then we do it again, controlling for the firm fixed effect. And those are the results that we get. So the gray line is without controlling for firms. So first we can see that there is a very large pay gap between immigrants and natives after arrival, but it takes about 25 years for this gap to eliminate. In this line, we show the results after controlling for firms. So here we compare native and immigrants as a function of the year since arrival that work at the same field. So what we can see from this figure, that after controlling for firms, the gap, about third of the gap is disappearing. So this is gives us the size of the magnitude of the importance of the firms. Here we do it in another way. We control also for the person fixed effect. So what we do essentially is to compare immigrant to himself or to herself after 25 years in Israel. And again, we do it with and without and with firm fixed effect. And those are the gaps that we get. So after controlling for the person fixed effect, the gap is smaller, but still is substantial. And here by definition, it closes after 25 years. So we see how the assimilation pattern over time. But again, after controlling for firms, the gap is about smaller, so in about 10 percentage points. So again, this is the magnitude of the importance of firms after controlling for person fixed effect. So here there is no sorting pattern of, like, that we know that people, that more talented people go to work in higher paying firms. So here we control for the person fixed effect, but still about 10 percentage points of the effect is coming only from the fact that immigrants don't work in good paying firms after they arrive, but this is disappearing after many years, after about 20 or 25 years in the new country. Okay, and finally, let me show you some evidence about the simulation in non-pay fame characteristics. So again, we do it with and without person fixed effect. So in the first comparison, we compare immigrants and natives, and we study different aspects of the job. And so again, we study pay premiums, which is similar to what I showed before, but we also study the size of the firm and the age of the firm. And we also do it for the self-simulation. So we compare the immigrant to himself or herself after 25 years. Okay, so let's start with the gray line, so the gap between immigrant and natives. So here we get again similar results. So that we get that about 10% 1 year after arrival, about immigrants work in lower paid things, and on average they work in fields that pay 10 percentage points less. But interestingly, after 18 years, they entirely close the gap, and afterwards they actually start to work in higher paying fields. So, but of course, it might be unique to this setup where we know that those immigrants were actually more educated than the natives, than the average native. We get again the same pattern for several simulations. So we show that if we compare immigrants to the immigrant himself after 25 years, at the first, once he arrived to Israel, he worked in lower paying firms. We get very similar patterns in terms of the size of the firm. So after arrival, they work in much smaller firms, about 3 times smaller firms. But then again, after almost 20 years in Israel, they actually start to work in larger firms compared to the natives. And also, once we control for the person fixed effect. And finally, after arrival, immigrants work in younger firms. So here we calculate the probability that they work in a field that is less than 5 years old. And we show that 1 year after arrival, the almost 15 percentage points, the probability to work in a young firm is almost 15 percentage points higher compared to a native. But after about 10 years in Israel, the gap is disappearing. Okay, so let me conclude. We exploit another combination of a massive historical migration episode together with good administrative records that cover the entire labor force and provide exact information about the immigrants. And we show that immigrants gradually sorting into better and better firms, and this explains large part of the wage catch-up between immigrants and natives. We also show that eventually immigrants start to actually work in better paying firms compared to natives. And we also show the simulation in other dimensions, in other properties of the firm attributes, such as the segregation, the size of the firm, and the age of the firm. So we conclude that firm-to-firm mobility is an important feature of the simulation of immigrants in the labor market. And as I said before, we studied in the context without any restriction on this mobility and on firm-to-firm mobility. So we can think about it as like a benchmark case. But this might be relevant, policy relevant for other countries that we can understand what is the cost of having this type of regulation that prevents workers to move between firms. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the great presentation. So we have our discussant, Danny Bahar from Brookings. Danny, the floor is yours. Feel free to share your slides if you have it.
Hello, everyone. Can you see the screen?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity to the organizers of discussing this paper, and hi to everyone, and for the authors also thank the authors for this great paper. So let me start by, I'm not gonna summarize the whole thing, but the punchline, the main takeaway from me is, well, this paper is looking at the simulation of immigrants, mostly in terms of wages. And of course, the firm dimension matter a lot, and sorting occurs and might change over time. So this paper is really trying to answer some of these questions here, put in a more general language. For instance, are immigrants taking lower paying jobs? Or are immigrants taking same jobs in lower paying firms? Or are immigrants assimilating more by getting better jobs or by moving to better paying firms, or both? And they're basically making a very good decomposition of all these questions, exploiting this natural experiment of the immigration from the former Soviet Union in the 1990s until today. This paper has everything I love in a paper. So I was really happy that I had the opportunity to discuss it. It's a relevant and a simple question that has great data that spans over a long period of time. So 25 years is quite a good enough period to understand these dynamics. It includes an elegant and a very simple framework. It has great visualization of the results, which I liked. And it's more of a descriptive, quote unquote, paper, and this is a compliment. And that's okay. And I think that's great. And we should be seeing more of these kind of papers, like trying to explain to us the dynamics of these big questions. It's about a topic and a place that I care about a lot, has policy implications, and the paper really is very airtight. So my comments are going to be mostly on big picture things and perhaps some further clarification. By the way, how much time do I have, Javad?
Danny, you have 5 more minutes.
Okay. So my first comment is a little bit on the sample. So on the worker side, these are small things, but I think it needs, it needs maybe perhaps a little more clarification. The sample only includes males. I wonder, if there was a reasoning for this, and whether by including females, there's more questions that can be asked in terms of the immigrant female income gap that I'm sure it plays a role there. The paper also excludes minorities in Israel, which makes sense because the minorities have very different education attainment than the immigrants, and have very unusual participation in the labor force. I'm talking mostly about ultra-Orthodox Jews and Arabs or Palestinian citizens of Israel. But by making these choices, you are implicitly selecting a counterfactual, the most integrated and most connected people in the labor force. So I wonder, are we setting the bar too high of comparing people who have all the connections to just new immigrants? And I don't find a way to get away from this, but I think at least maybe it's worth discussing in terms of how these results can be general, can provide a general answer to the question. In terms of the firms, I was a little bit interested in this because the firm, part of the analysis implies it uses only a set of firms that the authors call connected firms, which are firms where you can see movement of workers in and out just because of the empirical strategy. Some of the numbers on average were a little bit striking to me, and I thought they were a little bit off scale. So I think a worth of discussions here. The average firm size in the sample is 4,000 employees, and almost 2,000 for immigrants. I would like to say a little bit more of the distribution, because that means that on average, immigrants work in firms with 54% of other immigrants. That's another data point that they show. So these are firms that have almost 1,000 immigrants on average. So these to me are incredibly large firms. I don't know if the new firms that you just show in the graphs are also this size. It would be very unusual to see new firms by immigrants that are this large. And this is some data from the OECD, and it shows, for instance, that in Israel, this is a little bit old, it's from 2011, but it's inside of the sample. 70% of Israeli employees work in firms smaller than 250 employees. So of course, firm size has a very long fat tail, but I wonder, there must be a lot hidden in this distribution that I don't know how affect the results. A third comment is on counterfactuals. I think the data, of course, is almost as good as it gets. It's a very complete data set of matching employees and employers. There seems not to be a lot of info on the workers from what I was able to read, besides the year of arrival in the the year of arrival in the country and their age. So I wonder to what extent the migrant native comparison is limited because of this. The migrant comparison doesn't need this because we're comparing the same people, but the migrant native comparison, you know, I wonder, because we don't have any more controls, what if again, if we're setting the bar too high or this is the right counterfactual. I'm gonna skip this and give it to the authors later. My comment number 4 is, you know, the time span of this paper is beautiful. It's 25 years, and I think it's an important. You have to look at this from a long-term perspective. But in 25 years, also a lot of things have changed in the country and in the economy. TFP has gone up, perhaps not as much, but it has gone up and enough to change dynamics of many firms. So I wonder, you know, for such a long period, whether the firm pay premium, I mean, or I don't wonder. I think that the firm pay premium is actually measuring a 25-year average. When you just add a firm fixed effect, it's measuring average for a very long period of time. So I wasn't clear. It wasn't clear to me if there are changes. You know, if these firms are changing a lot across time, whether we are underestimating or underestimating some of the results. And I wonder if you know, is it possible to do something here with firm year fixed effects? I'm not sure if the variation will allow it. I'm not sure, at least, if it makes sense to show perhaps in an appendix that the firm pay fixed effect is not changing dramatically over the years. This is a similar comment. The composition of the Israeli economy has changed a lot. So there's a huge increase in employment in services, high tech, and IT, and a strong decline in employment and industry. So this movement of firms can also imply movements across sectors, which probably pay very different. So I wonder how this plays a role in these results. So summing up, I love this paper. I'm excited to see a Polish version whenever that happens. No pressure, guys. I think there are endless possibilities of additional super interesting questions with this data on entrepreneurship and migration, labor market integration of immigrants in the context of this massive refugee flow more generally. I wish we could say something more about the type of firms that they're more likely to be hired in. And if industry information is available, which I wasn't sure, I think there's a lot of great questions to ask in terms of structural transformation in the context of big immigration flow. So I might follow up with you guys offline on this, but thanks so much for the great paper, and I look forward to a next version.
Danny, thank you very much for the great discussion. Before, Shumel, before you answer to Danny's comments, let's first see whether there are any questions in the audience. Do we have any questions? If you have questions, please unmute yourself and directly ask Shumel.
Okay, so let me start, and if
please go ahead.
Stop me with questions if there are. Okay, so yeah, yes, thank you very much, Danny, for the great discussion and great comments. Yeah, so we have very many good great concerns and great questions. So let me just answer to a few of them. So yeah, we study the males only just as an example, because we have computational limitation in the lab that we are able to access the data. So yeah, we plan to do it also for women. I'm not sure that we can study both of them together, but it's like we're going to do it separately from female, of course. Yeah, about the minority here, it's more tricky question. As you kind of mentioned, it's not only that they are different, but also they have different trends. So once, for example, yeah, in many other papers, so show that, for example, the employment rate of male ultra-Orthodox dramatically changed over time. So we try to abstract from those changes, but of course we can include them as like, you know, to show the robustness of the results to that. That's a good point. Yeah, you're right that the average film is quite large. We need to think about it better. Actually, I think because it happened because we have, I think, like few films that are very large, like more than 100,000 workers, which, yeah. So, I mean, of course we can drop them, but then we drop a large, again, many more workers. But I think in like the average worker or the average firm actually has a much smaller number of workers. So I think I'm not sure about the number, but it's about the same number that you showed. So, but yeah, of course we should see what happens when we drop those giant firms. As you rightly mentioned, we don't have good information about the workers, about education, and other information about the skills of the workers so far. I mean, maybe it's going to change in the future. Yes, that's why, I mean, as you mentioned that's why we always compare our immigrant native comparison, and we compare immigrant to themselves always. So yeah, we try to measure it in both ways. Yeah, we of course, yeah, that's, but we see that's why we get this interesting pattern that actually immigrants start to work in better firms compared to natives after many years. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we do control for year fixed effects, but you're still right that the firm fixed effect might change over time. So of course we cannot control for every year firm fixed effect, but we might, let's say, have 2 periods for each firm or something like that. But yeah, I want to emphasize that it's not that every firm exists for 25 years. That's not, we don't receive the sample. So most of the firms are much, the time period is much shorter. And but yeah, we have industry. So if you have ideas how to use it, that could be great. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. So I would like to check one more time whether if there are any questions from the audience. So if not, I would like to ask perhaps a clarification question, or I find it very interesting that you show us this graph. Initially there's a wage gap between migrants and natives, and after 15 years it closes, but not only it closes, but the wage, basically the sign flips. So I was wondering what explains this. So at what type of migrants started making more than natives, because it is kind of a new finding, I think, in the literature as well. So is it because the type of occupations they started working initially, and they kind of started accumulating over time and they are making more? Or do you have any idea for this?
Yeah, so actually, so the total wage, is exactly closing after 25 years, the gaps in the wage. What we do show is that the contribution of the firm fixed effects, as you say, is flipping. So actually, immigrants will start to work in better firms compared to natives. Yeah, so as we said, we suspect that it is the effect of the fact that the immigrants are more educated and belong to higher skill groups in this case, which is kind of, I guess, yeah. So this is a setup in this episode. Yeah, we don't claim that it is, of course, it's true in general. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Shuma. So then let's move on to the second presentation. So we are very happy to have Madeleine Zavadny from University of North Florida. Madeleine, the floor is yours. You have 20 minutes.
All right. Thank you very much. I am delighted to be with everyone today. Hopefully you are seeing the slides.
Yes.
Yes, good. All right. So many thanks in advance to Sarah for her comments. The paper is at a very preliminary stage, so any and all comments from everyone will be very welcome. So this is a paper on the United States about the effect of what's called ICE raids and audits. ICE is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So it's the U.S. government agency that's really in charge of immigration enforcement within the interior. And we fit well into this session about firms because what we're looking at is what is the industry level response in terms of hiring, firing, employment, wages, and so on to having enforcement actions at businesses. Just to give you sort of since we have a very international diverse audience here today, which is wonderful, a very brief history of migrant workers in the United States. I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about the, a century ago from Brana Vermitsky later on today. But if you go back about a century in the United States, it was the first time that really became difficult to enter the United States, and the concept of illegal immigration from the Western Hemisphere even became a possibility really only 100 years ago. So in response to the enormous inflows into the United States before World War I, we saw restrictions imposed during the 1920s. Then when we entered the Great Depression, and labor markets collapsed in the United States, the U.S. not only continued to keep its borders closed and made those borders even tighter, but began pushing out what were at the time legal immigrants and expelled lots of Mexicans and literally deported them back to Mexico. Then during World War II, we realized there was a tremendous need for low-skilled labor in the United States. And so the United States created with Mexico what was called the Bracero program, that created a way for what were primarily low-skilled Mexican men to legally enter into the southwestern United States to work primarily in the agricultural industry. When World War II ends, we begin to wrap up and shrink the Bracero program, and we revert largely to inflows from the Western Hemisphere coming largely illegally. One thing that a lot of people in the United States don't remember about this period is that although it was illegal to cross the border without a visa, it was somewhat oddly legal to employ an illegal immigrant. So someone could be illegally present in the United States, yet working legally. And this was called the Texas Proviso, because Texas employers and other employers as well, pushed very hard for this. And so it's a somewhat unusual situation that persisted for a long time. Then in 1986, this finally comes to an end with the Immigration Reform and Control Act, or IRCA. And so what IRCA does in 1986 is that it does this mass legalization program, the largest one that we've had probably in US history. But it also now says that if you aren't legally present in the United States, it's illegal for an employer to hire you. At first, employers really panic, and then within a year or two, they start to realize this law is relatively easily circumvented, that you can just have people show you some fake IDs, check the boxes on the paperwork, and nothing much really happens. So I think there was a pretty quick adjustment by most unauthorized immigrants and by most of their employers to realizing that this law had no teeth. Well, politicians realized it as well. And so in 1996, under a law with not as good of an acronym there, the IIR-IRA, we get kind of more recognition that we need some enforcement mechanisms. And so what the IIR-IRA does is it creates a program called Basic Pilot, which later gets renamed E-Verify, which gives employers now a tool where they can go online, initially over the phone, and then as the internet gets created, thanks to Al Gore in theory, where employers can check whether or not these documents that their new hires are presenting to them are actually valid. So is that a valid social security number and name so that that worker appears to be legally authorized to work in the United States? Then we hit 2001 under President Bush, where 9/11 suddenly really changes the way the United States perceives immigration, and particularly unauthorized immigration becomes viewed as much more of a threat from a national security perspective. So this is when the Department of Homeland Security gets created, and ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, is an agency within the Department of Homeland Security. And really we get an enormous crackdown on immigration, that the borders really get closed for a while for legal immigration as we figure out how to better screen immigrants. But perhaps more importantly, we begin to scrutinize unauthorized immigrants and their employers much more tightly. At the same time, states begin to implement more laws against unauthorized immigrants, either targeting the immigrants directly via police action or targeting employers, like laws that require E-Verify. So there's been this tremendous change over time. We're really looking at the end of this period starting under President Bush within this paper, but I think that the broader context is somewhat important to get. Right, so in the 2000s, after 9/11, we have this massive ramp up that starts to occur within the interior that's really new to the United States. So one phase of this was what was called the no match letter campaign, where if you hired somebody and their social security number didn't match their name, and then you were filing basically tax records for this individual as an employer, you got sent a letter. That told you that there was something wrong. And this was the first time a lot of employers became aware that, oh, that number that they're submitting doesn't match their name, that perhaps this person is an illegal immigrant or unauthorized immigrant and not authorized to work in the United States. And the employer was supposed to follow up and resolve this and ultimately dismiss the worker. Then we get basic pilot again becoming E-Verify, and E-Verify expands. It starts in just a few states and then expands under President Bush to all of the states. And again, we start getting some states requiring some employers or all employers to use it. And so in 2007, Arizona passes the first law requiring all employers to use E-Verify to check that their new hires are legally eligible to work in the United States. We then get more raids and audits, more investigations, charges being filed by the Department of Homeland Security, some arrests occurring not only of workers, but also of managers or even executives within firms, and substantial fines. I'll show you that in a little bit. And there's just more and more attention being paid in this post 9/11 world to these immigration enforcement actions. So we get some really high profile raids under the second President Bush that just, they're on the national news and it's enormous coverage, and activists are getting very upset. Local politicians are upset, and just a lot of awareness. So we have meat packing plants, wood pallet manufacturers, and so on, where there are these large scale arrests that are occurring within workplaces. And this is really just an unprecedented level of attention to this. Under President Obama in 2009, we shift from these workplace raids to instead paperwork audits as to whether employers have followed all of the guidelines when they hire workers. And these perhaps don't sound as high profile, but nonetheless, there was some considerable media attention devoted to these actions. For example, Chipotle, the Mexican fast food restaurant, underwent one of these audits, and they had to fire 450 workers. And you saw headlines across the United States because this was so unexpected and dramatic, and Chipotle was really reeling from this action. So again, this is the context that we're looking at. So just to give you, some ideas to what kind of time series we're looking at, we have here in the blue bars the number of worksite enforcement arrests, primarily of workers, but again, sometimes of higher level managers and even executives in firms. And what you see in 2006 and through 2008 under President Bush is large increase in large number of these arrests. What you see in orange is the fines that are being assessed by ICE of employers for not complying with immigration laws. Again, you see those going up, coming back down, kind of initially in the Obama years, and then coming back up. So this is, large scale, really unprecedented enforcement activity. So what we're looking at in the paper, again, is what is the effect of these enforcement actions on businesses? What we're interested in here is looking at newspaper accounts of enforcement activity at the industry level and seeing if there are newspaper accounts that an enforcement action happened in your industry. How does the industry respond? And we look at this in two ways. We look at whether firms in the industry sign up for E-Verify, this database through which that employers can use to check whether or not their workers are legally authorized to work in the United States, and that could in theory be an affirmative defense against any actions by ICE. And second, do employers within an industry begin to change their employment, change their wages, perhaps in response to who they can hire, and change their hire and firing patterns after there's enforcement activity as learned of in the news media in their industry. All right. The unauthorized immigrant workforce in the US is large, it's about 5%, and it's very unevenly distributed across states and industries. And we know some about it, but there's not a large literature looking at it at the industry level. So we think that this is a contribution here, right? And we will certainly hear from Sarah what she thinks about that contribution. Just to give you a quick preview of the results. Following news reports of an immigration enforcement action, we find that there is a significant increase in E-Verify signups. So basically, if you see that there's been an action in your industry that's gotten a lot of media attention, firms then become more likely to register to participate in this database through which they can check whether or not their workers are legally authorized. Again, this might offer you some defense and make you less likely to be raided or audited or arrested by ICE. And then looking at the employment and wage data, we find interestingly that wages fall, which I'm not sure we would have expected. We find a little bit of evidence of negative employment effects. And perhaps even more surprisingly to us, we find a decrease in turnover. And so what do we think about this at the end of the day is that, interestingly, we don't find a lot of evidence that employers lay off large enough numbers of unauthorized workers who are on the books, probably working under false social security numbers, to show up in the data. But nonetheless, they appear to be passing on the costs of intensified immigration enforcement in the form of lower pay to their workers. There's been very little studies in the United States about workplace enforcement. There was one study by Bennett that looked at I-9 audits using some FOIA data from the US government that finds that there appears to be a positive effect on employment, perhaps because when employers get audited, they move workers from off the books to on the books. There's been some studies more at the population level looking at the effect of raids that Robert Santillano and colleagues find that it looks like worksite raids, like the kind that we're looking at here of these meat packing plants and so on, cause migrants to move into the shadows, in particular of withdrawing their children from school programs, but to not actually move locations or to stop working. There have also been a lot of case studies about adverse mental and physical health effects done by the public health literature. There's a broader literature looking at the effect of enforcement, these E-Verify laws and police enforcement where local law enforcement can do arrests of suspected unauthorized immigrants and start the deportation process that looks at individual level data instead of firm level data. And those studies tend to find negative effects, particularly for men, with some evidence perhaps that unauthorized immigrant women become more likely to work when their husbands experience adverse effects. But these are, again, more individual or household level studies as opposed to the industry level study that we're doing here. All right, so the theoretical framework that we have in mind here is that worksite enforcement's expensive, right? If you face sanctions, then that's going to be costly to you. And also participating in E-Verify, while it can be an affirmative defense, is also costly for businesses because you have to go through this paperwork process and perhaps go through all of it after extending an offer to a worker and then find out you actually can't hire that worker. Right. And so we think that by making the cost of labor higher and the cost of doing business higher, these raids and enforcement and more generally immigration regulation decreases labor demand, and it's going to result ultimately in lower earnings, right, lower wages and lower employment. It's not clear to us what we expect in terms of turnover, and the short run effect might be different from the long run effect. Just depending on what the compositional effect is on the workers, right? So we had the Dallas Fed research assistants do this huge compilation of worksite enforcement actions and created our data set. I'm happy to share the paper with you if you want details about it. And again, what we're focused on is really these newspaper articles that are a count at the industry by quarter level of whether or not there was an enforcement action in your industry. And then we're going to merge that with some E-Verify data that we have on enrollment, and then census QWI data. So it's this industry level data on employment, wages, turnover, and so on. And we're going to look at this at the industry level with controls, all of that. We look at a whole bunch of different enforcement actions. So the RAs classified things as raids, audits. They looked at fines, they looked at charges, they looked at arrests. And so they did these different measures of enforcement action. And you can see our time series of these actions over time, which sort of mirrors the data that I was showing you earlier, the ramp up kind of in the mid 2000s toward the tail end of the Bush administration. We tried also looking at this at state level as well as industry level and didn't find much. So we look at different enforcement actions. Again, we look at outcomes of E-Verify and then wages, employment, and measures of turnover. Right, so kind of standard OLS, industry by quarter regressions. And we have a whole bunch of tables in the paper. Of course, Sarah had to wade through a lot of tables. Just to give you kind of a preview of the results, since I'm quickly running out of time here, I suspect. What we find, not surprisingly to us, is that when there are more actions in your industry, there's an increase in E-Verify signups. So basically, if you learn that there's been raids, audits, arrests, and so on in your industry, there's an increase in the number of firms signing up to participate in the E-Verify program. Interestingly, we also find that average wages, so payroll divided by workers, goes down when there's more enforcement a quarter or 2 quarters ago in your industry. So this is, we think, consistent with higher labor costs being passed on to workers or a decrease in labor demand. For turnover, again, we didn't have a clear expectation as to what was going to happen, but we find some suggestion of reduced turnover, but also some suggestion of increased turnover. Interestingly to us, we don't find anything much on employment effects, that it's really the wages and then the turnover, the hires and fires that are changing. And so again, the paper has a whole bunch of tables. I'm going to skip that in the interest of time, and because you can really absorb that in this way. And so I think the takeaway from the paper to us is that firms in many ways respond in the way that we expect, that when you get increased enforcement, they try to comply, right? And they try to then start checking and making themselves less vulnerable to enforcement by participating in E-Verify, at least in enrolling in it. And then they reduce their labor demand. And we think that this decrease in turnover that we find is perhaps not good for the economy because it's reducing dynamism. And it may mean that unauthorized workers are trapped with their employers because it's suddenly become a lot harder to switch jobs if more employers are participating in E-Verify. This last bullet here, we find it somewhat surprising that we don't find an increase in hiring and firing right away, or an increase in employment. And what this suggests to us is that many unauthorized immigrants are already on the books, working under false identities, right? And that employers don't change very much of what they do with regard to those workers as enforcement increases in their industry. They just pass along lower wages. And of course, we want to do more research on this topic, and we encourage others to as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Sarah.
Madeline, thank you very much. Sarah, you can share your slides.
Do you see it?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So hi everyone, thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss this paper. I'm just gonna. So here just a summary of the paper. So it looks at the effect of immigrant enforcement action as reported by US media for the period 2004-2016 by industry and quarters, and the author finds that the take-up of E-Verify increases, that wage falls, and turnover seems to decline. So basically, when I received the paper to discuss, I was really attracted to the subject. So I was really eager to read it because and it delivers because it's really important in terms of policy implication. It's highly relevant in terms of political agenda, and there is not already a large literature on the subject. I find that the question is answered through an interesting source of data that I suspected to be collected in quite a time-intensive way. I found that it was a clever approach to perform the analysis at the industry level, and it also provided some interesting and sometimes surprising first results. So the preliminary versions that I got really seemed to have a great potential overall. So some stuff were like not clear to me upon reading the paper. First, whether you could identify a firm and turn your dataset into a firm level dataset. This was not clear from the description. Whether also your employment data would cover employment of illegal migrants. I would also have been interested in having a bit of descriptive statistics on how your variables evolve over time, a bit like you showed in your slides, and also by industries. Yeah, so some question on the data as well, like what does the other type of data does other research use? Could you check the correlation with your media reported variable for at least some states if some data exist? Then another point is regarding to the exogeneity of rates and their reporting by the press. So I was wondering if some sector would be in a difficult economic condition, could that increase either the enforcement action in that sector or the reporting by the media in the sector? Especially because in your specification with the labor market outcomes, you cannot control for the business cycles. Then on the interpretation of the results, I would suggest you to check the accordance between the results in the text and what is presented in the tables, because sometimes there are some inaccuracies. I was wondering why you didn't try to group all enforcement actions together. So for now, you just present each enforcement action separately. And I understand that there might be an external validity issue if you would just put them all together, but maybe it could bring more consistency into the results. Then in the text, you nicely describe how each president administration had its own preferred enforcement action. And I was wondering whether you could show some heterogeneity of the effect by the president administration. And also related to the data, it would be nice to have the graph you showed in your presentation to understand really from where the variation is coming from. Also, you say that some states' laws mandate revoking business license of employers who violate the law. So I was wondering whether you could have some heterogeneity along the magnitude of the risks that is faced by employers of different states. And then it was more question related to the data, if you could have some information on the characteristic of the workers. And related to my point on whether you could have an industry level data set, if you could study spillover or contingent effect within a firm, because you gave some examples that you had firms with multiple locations and one location was hit, and it would be interesting to see if you could study the other location to see if there is a contagion effect. Then just a quick clarifying question on whether what you what you estimate actually is the effect of the reporting of these raids. So how could you differentiate between the enforcement actions themselves or the salience of the migration topic in your industry? And I was also wondering whether there could be a demand shock driving the result. For instance, if there is a news that an industry got raided because they were hiring undocumented immigrants, could the sales of the industry decrease and so the wage decrease? And then I would have been interested in having some information on whether the effect is linear in terms of timing or the number of enforcement action in the industry. Another point is that because you focus on raids that are reported by the media, you just focus on big enforcement action that are usually performed in large firms. And so it would be interesting to see how your effect vary with the average firm size of the industry, and to clarify that also in terms of policy implication. And finally, just some suggestion on other potential outcomes that could be interesting. For instance, firms' investment, productivity, profits, and also the number of firms. So that's all for me.
All right, thank you very much for the very thorough discussion. So, Madeleine, before you reply to Sarah's comments, I would like to check whether there are any questions in the audience, from the audience. So, do we have any questions?
I'll ask a question, Joe.
Yeah, go ahead, Steve. Thank you.
I was just wondering, I think this point that Sarah raised about the endogeneity of the raids, maybe also the reporting too, is really important. I'm wondering if you could kind of take advantage of political cycles, maybe. Maybe Francesco down below can offer you some advice on this, because he has the paper that does this. That's a nice thing you have. You have both the kind of the national cycle on enforcement, but I'm guessing you also have a lot of across state variation too. I know, for example, California doesn't have ICE rates mostly, if they can avoid them. They can't avoid them entirely. So, some combination probably of the affiliation of different, political affiliation of governors combined with the change of the political cycle over time might help you identify at least help answer the question about why ICE rates happen. I do worry that you would think that there's just a lot of endogeneity, both in trying to make targets are picked, I think, intentionally, either to make a political spin of it or to, and whether that relates to their productivity or hiring or anything that's a more difficult question, but it's clearly not random. So, I do think it's something that worth looking more deeply at.
Do we have any other questions?
I had a quick question.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Yeah, sorry if I missed it, but I guess the declared policy goal of this type of, that they try to restrict employment of immigrants is to prevent immigrants to come to the country. So I wonder if you can check that. You show that it doesn't affect the natives, right? The employment and wages of natives, but yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting if actually the policy goal is achieved.
Thanks, Shamal. Alice also has a question. Alice, go ahead, please.
Yes, hi. I think it's a little bit in the same line as Shmuel question. And first of all, I thank you for this great paper. I find it extremely interesting. And I just wonder whether it is possible among these enforcement measures, which are very important to distinguish from the rates, whether it's possible to look at sanctions that are falling more onto the shoulders of the employers and some kind of enforcement that would be much more costly for the workers. In particular, whether these arrested undocumented workers at the end may be deported. So that might depend on where it is enforced. And presumably, this may have very different effects. So perhaps the fact that you find a rather negative effect on wages points to the fact that the enforcement the sanctions are against the employers, but it may not necessarily be the case. So it is another source of heterogeneity in the effects that you may find.
Thanks, Alice. I also would like to ask one quick question, and then perhaps it's going to be a suggestion for an extension. But I was wondering whether you consider trying to figure out how actually enforcement actions in the US affects migration intentions and illegal crossings from Mexico to the US. I think you can do this two ways. One is if you have access to Gallup World Poll, you can look at migration intentions because you have large time span. And then perhaps you can also look at the illegal crossings. Of course, that data will have some issues, but I think the shock itself will be more exogenous if you are located in Mexico or other Latin American or South American countries. And on top of that, you have 5 minutes to answer all these questions, Madeleine. Good luck.
Oh gosh. Well, thank you all so very much. This is enormously helpful. And I'm just going to say, you know, if Pia were here, she would have answers to all of it, of course, but unfortunately she's caught up with bank work today. I do think Steve is right that the targets are in some ways picked politically and probably picked for news value in many ways. They are certainly not random, and perhaps in some cases they are targets that have been fingered by a competitor. One might wonder in some cases why these firms, when hiring of unauthorized immigrants is widespread within an industry, why pick that particular firm at that particular time? So this is something that we do absolutely need to think harder about. I love Sarah's suggestion about grouping all of our enforcement actions together and looking for heterogeneity by presidential administration. I think the United States is just so odd in many ways. Perhaps that many of these unauthorized immigrants are working on the books, and so they are in the in this employer-based data, just not as themselves. That they're working with somebody else's name, and they just, you know, if caught, show up with a new identity the next day and a new false social security number name, and everyone has traditionally turned a blind eye to it. Until these raids started happening. And so it's an interesting topic. And with that, I will say thank you all. We've given me us a lot to work on.
Great, thank you very much, Madeleine. So we have our last paper in the session. So Matilde Munoz will present offshoring, traded non-tradables, offshoring service jobs through labor mobility. Matilde, the floor is yours.
Great, can you see my slides?
Yes.
And can you hear me well? Don't hesitate to tell me if you cannot hear.
Everything is great for the moment. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be given the opportunity to present this paper today, which is about how labor mobility policy can make some jobs offshoreable. So the key idea of this project is actually quite simple. It starts from the assumption we have been making that some locally provided services and jobs, such as construction, cleaning, or plumbing, are sheltered from international trade because they need to be produced very close to the customers and therefore cannot be exchanged from one country to another. In this paper, I challenged the standard definition of tradability or offshoreability by arguing that labor mobility policy can indeed make all jobs potentially offshoreable. And this is the case because service suppliers can send their workers abroad in order to perform a service, which leads some services to be offshored on the site of the client by foreign employees. So today I'm going to talk about the world where you can actually offshore part of your construction or plumbing services to foreign firms. And so this novel trade and migration intersection actually raises novel questions for policymakers compared to standard trade or standard migration. So first, by exposing novel firms and novel workers to a different type of international competition, it calls for a reassessment of whether international trade exposure has hurt or benefit these workers at these sectors that account for a very large share of overall employment. Second, there is also a unique intersection in this type of trade and mobility where the offshore service is actually produced in the destination country, which requires that policymakers ultimately have to decide whether destination or origin labor taxes should be applied to this novel type of flows in terms of workers, but also of services produced. In this paper, I'm going to shed new light on this issue by exploiting the largest liberalization of cross-border services supply for labor mobility in the world, which is the implementation of the European posting policy in Europe. So with this European policy, all services provided by foreign firms within the EU are actually authorized by default. So therefore, foreign firms are allowed to send their employees in another member state to perform a service without any entry restriction. And posted workers are, in addition, exempted from all taxes in destination countries. I'm going to combine in this paper this continent-wide experiment with novel administrative data sets and novel quasi-experimental variations in order to address mainly 3 questions that relate to on-site offshoring. I'm going to first try to ask how large and different is this novel trade and mobility channel compared to standard trade and standard migration that have been studied in the literature. Then I'm going to try to show you to what extent can mobility policies actually trigger trade in services and what is the magnitude of these flows. And then I'm going to try to shed light on who are the winners and who are the losers of allowing on-site services offshoring through labor mobility policies. All right. So before answering a little bit more precisely to this question, let me introduce to the setting I'm using in this paper. So this is an example of a posting of a worker from Poland to Germany. So the way it works is that you have a sending firm that is located in Poland, a receiving firm or a client located in Germany. And these 2 firms are going to agree on a service that needs to be performed on the territory of Germany, say a plumbing or a construction service, to go back to my example. And so they're going to be an export of a service from Poland to Germany in exchange of this service contract that is paid by the receiving firm. And then in order to perform the service, the posted workers that are sending firms employees going to be sent temporarily to Germany in order to perform this work activity, this service. And so while they are working in Germany, their employment contract, their wage and their tax is going to still be linked to Poland. And therefore, what is this very flexible framework allows is to remove some frictions that would be in place in the absence of the policy. So typically, posted workers do not have to get an employment or social security affiliation in Germany, and sending firm does not have to get a license in Germany, does not have to ask to Germany if the workers can enter the labor market in order to perform the service, and does not have to pay payroll taxes in Germany. So this very flexible policy has been implemented in 1959, and it's only available for EU member states, meaning that firms located outside the EU actually have to require an entry authorization for performing the services in the EU to the destination country. So in this paper, I'm going to combine this very flexible framework with novel data sets on trade-related mobility flows within the EU, and mostly I'm going to use 2 types of data today. The first data set I use is a Europe-wide social security data set on posted workers that is based on social security mandatory forms issued for posting of workers within the EU. And so this is going to allow me to observe the universe of bilateral posting flows over time within the EU. In order to get more granular details on who are the receiving firm, the sending firms, and the posted workers, I'm going to complete this data set with additional micro-administrative data set on posting of workers in 4 countries: Portugal, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. And in these 4 countries, I'm going to have access to exhaustive posting registries at the posting firm and worker level that are going to allow me to really identify who is posting workers, who are the posted workers, and who is actually using the services performed by the posted workers. So with this data at hand, I'm going to be able to address the first question of the paper and of my introduction, which is how large is on-site offshoring and how different it is from standard trade and standard migration. So in order to maybe assess the magnitude of how large is this novel trade and mobility channel, this graph shows you the evolution of the number of workers that have been sent abroad in order to perform a service within the EU. And so as you can see from this graph, there has been a real boom in the number of postings in the EU that has started in 2004, mostly, but that has kept growing at a very important rate. And so in order to understand a little bit more what is driving the magnitude and this increase, and is it really big compared to other international, this graph compares labor posting to another type of mobility in the EU, which is standard migration. And so what you can see in this graph is that the number of workers that are sent abroad by firms in order to perform a service tend to be twice larger than the number of people who actually change their residence country in order to work in another country. And so this graph shows you that to get a sense of how many people are actually affected by international exposure within Europe, or how many people can actually benefit from the opportunity to work abroad, you really need to take into account trade-related mobility flows, because they tend to be very large compared to standard migration flows. All right, so on-site offshoring is not only very big and increasing in magnitude, it is also very different from standard trade and standard migration. And so the way to see this is first to focus on who are the jobs that are actually offshored using this novel type of mobility. So this graph shows you the decomposition of the job missions that are performed by posted workers within the EU. And so as you can see, these jobs tend to be mostly focused on occupations and jobs that have been defined as sheltered from international trade. So agriculture, construction, and manufacturing services. And so using microdata, I am able to rank top jobs that are offshore to posted workers. And these top jobs are typically builder, plumber, welder, pipe fitter, cleaner, and farm workers. So typically manual workers whose job we thought were protected from competition from foreign firms, and that happen to be actually performed by foreign employees sent by foreign suppliers on the site of the client, all right? And so driven by the different nature of the services that are traded through labor mobility policy, this leads posting exporters to be actually quite different from standard exporters we have been studying in the literature. So this graph shows you the distribution of the size measured in terms of turnover of standard exporting firms in manufacturing industry compared to firms exporting services through posting of workers abroad in non-tradable services. And so what you can see, because these sectors tend to be characterized by smaller firms that are less capital intensive, exporting firms in non-tradable services that use posting in order to send their workers abroad actually are quite smaller and different from manufacturing exporting. So this graph shows you that it is not only different jobs that are affected by international competition, it is also different exporters that tend to have access to foreign markets through the lens of a novel labor mobility. And so finally, the last type of difference between on-site offshoring and other international channels relates to the difference in terms of characteristics regarding the people who choose to move abroad in order to work and to change their residence country, by contrast to posted workers that are sent abroad by their employers in order to perform a service. And so here you see differences in characteristics of posted workers versus migrants for a given destination country, which is here Belgium. And so what you can see in this graph is that posted workers tend to actually be quite different from migrants. So they tend to be older, they tend to be much more men, they tend to work in much more often in construction, but most importantly, they also tend to be much less tertiary educated, even when you control for origin countries. So this also again suggests that the people that are affected by this novel type to train and this novel type to move are also different in the respect of people who actually get exposed to the opportunity to work abroad. All right, so now that I showed you that on-site offshoring is big, increasing, and tend to be quite different from standard international trade and standard international migration, let's move to the second part of the paper, which is to what extent can actually mobility policy affect cross-border services supply? And so to first shed light on this issue, I'm going to first show you how lifting entry restriction for foreign suppliers' employees actually affect overall cross-border services provision. And so in order to do this, I'm going to exploit a unique experiment in my setup, which is provided by EU enlargements that started in 2004 and affected 13 new member states that are located in Eastern Europe. And so for these certain countries, I am able to observe the transition from posting autarky to full liberalization. And so what do I mean by posting autarky? These countries were, before their entry into the EU, they were non-EU member state, therefore they had to request an entry authorization in order to be able to perform services in EU member state. as soon as these countries entered in the EU, they were entitled freedom to provide services in this country, and therefore entry restrictions for workers posted from these countries were lifted. And what is really interesting in this setup is that the timing of the lifting of posting liberalization was actually staggered at the origin and destination year level, which allows me to have a very nice exogenous variation in this timing that I can use to compare postings from treated versus control origin country before and after the entry restrictions are lifted in destination that liberalized or did not yet liberalize posting in their labor market. And so running this type of staggered difference in difference model, this is what you get. So you see that as soon as a given destination country lifts entry restriction for workers posted from an origin country, the provision of services from this origin country to this destination country starts to increase dramatically and permanently. And so this is prima facie evidence that, of course, lifting entry restriction for the employees of a given foreign supplier is going to increase the amount of services that can be offshored on the site of firms located in destination countries. And this increase in overall service provision are quite large. So to get a sense of the magnitude, allowing firms to send their workers abroad to perform the service by the lifting of entry restriction increases permanently cross-border service provision by 500%, which means that mobility policy indeed has a large trade creation effect. But this is difficult ultimately to interpret as the pure effect of the mobility policy. So in order to further understand what is cross-border services supply responses to mobility policies, I'm going to first explore the second type of tool that policymakers have in order to regulate cross-border services supply, which is tax policy. And so in the case of Europe, the posting policy creates very sharp wage cost differentials. Why? Because it allows for the same destination country and workers performing the same service, sometimes in the same location, to have drastically different labor costs. Why? Because they are posted from different countries, all right? And I'm going to exploit this type of origin-specific labor cost variation within a destination country to estimate what has been the responsiveness of cross-border services supply flows through posting to changes in labor costs in origin countries. And so in the paper, I have exogenous payroll tax reform, but today I'm going to focus on a simple Europe-wide gravity equation when I'm going to just look at what is the correlation between these two variables, all right? So to first illustrate this point, this graph shows you that posted workers flows tend to go from low to high labor cost country, which tend to indicate already that there is a link that is quite strong between level of payroll taxes and demand and supply of posted workers. So of course, there are many determinants that could be correlated simultaneously with tax policy and posted workers demand and supply. Therefore, I move to a theory consistent gravity equation. I have a model in the paper that maybe we can talk about in the questions, but to explain quite briefly, this type of estimation controls for all time varying factors in the destination country and sometimes in the origin country in order to only isolate the effect of origin specific changes in payroll taxes. And so what you can see here is that the estimates of the posting elasticity are quite stable, robust, and quite large, with a median estimate of 1.1, which means that a 1% increase in the labor cost in the sending country would decrease posting of workers or services supply from this country by 1.1%. And so, interestingly, the estimates that are given by this type of theory consistent gravity equation are actually very close to the reduced form quasi-natural experiment estimate I do in the paper using reforms, which hinge on the credibility somehow of this posting elasticity. So to summarize, I showed you that mobility policy triggers large services offshoring flows and mainly by two channels. I show you that lifting entry restriction increases cross-border services flows by 500%, and that tax policy also affects posting flows because posting flows are significantly affected by potential tax exemptions that are granted to posted workers with an elasticity that is above 1. And so interestingly, this elasticity is lower than the trade elasticity that is usually around 4, and slightly higher than the migration elasticity that is around 0.5, 0.6 in Europe, which again tend to indicate that posting is exactly at the intersection between trade and migration, all right?
Matilda, thank you very much for the great presentation. Our discussion is Simon.
Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, thanks, Stu.
Thanks. Thanks for having me as a discussant. Thanks, Matilde, for your paper. So I think, well, this is a good sign. My summary is basically exactly the same as her conclusion, so I won't say it again. But I think the important thing, okay, for me, this was a really interesting paper because I have to say, as somebody who works a ton on migration and lives in Europe, I still knew absolutely nothing about this international posting system. So I think probably most of us will say the same thing, that we didn't know that it exists, and then it's amazingly large. So Matilde has done an enormous amount of work around data collection and documenting what's happened. So that's something that she can't reflect in this short of a talk, but I mean, she's really, I think she's created a research area in some sense. So I mean, that's a huge contribution already. So she basically exploits the entry into the EU of the accession countries, and also changes in regulatory and policy frameworks over time to basically tell us a lot about job posting. I mean, that's kind of the paper really, she showed us about workers, firms, governments. The paper has a lot more. I mean, it's a big paper in many ways. So I guess I just have, she and I can talk a lot more about the paper at some point, but just, I had a couple of kind of maybe a core kind of questions. They're more ideas than probably any criticisms of the paper. The paper uses a lot of nice natural experiments, has a lot of well done technical stuff. I mean, one question I had when thinking about this, and this isn't, I don't think, so I mean, what Matilde does, I mean, she basically looks at changes in labor posting when she's thinking about like her first stuff she showed you, like gravity models. So, I mean, clearly this is gonna go up a lot, especially if you start from zero. So, I mean, the 500% number sounds very impressive, but of course, the initial number almost by rule is almost zero. So, I mean, it's almost an infinity increase. So I know it is possible. I know they could get that they did have some posting before joining the EU. So I was trying to think in my mind, I think it's a complementary analysis, not a separate one. But I was thinking that you also want to, I mean, to me, the bigger question is kind of, does the ability to post kind of increase the overall employment opportunities? I mean, clearly people from a lot of these Eastern European countries, they already have access to the EU labor market even before ascension. So I mean, they have both illegal access. They also had, some of them had access through commuter rights. So for example, Czech Republic with Germany had rules already about people being able to access the labor market even before they joined the EU. And I also think on the other end, I don't think Matilde can really look at it in her data. I suspect a lot of posted workers kind of may end up becoming migrants. Because for the posted worker, it's a pretty mediocre deal in a sense. I mean, you go to Germany, but you're getting paid by a Romanian firm. You might get a little premium maybe over what you get in Romania, but you're not getting a German wage. So clearly you're going to see people working in the German construction industry. And if you're Romanian, you're allowed to do it also. So, I mean, that's a pretty big incentive to leave the posting system. I don't know. She probably knows a lot more about the regulatory framework that maybe stops people from doing this, or the people don't want to do it because they don't want to become permanent migrants. So I think it would be really interesting. I think you can do it by combining the labor force surveys with the posting data to just kind of also ask the supplemental question, like instead of the outcome being posting, the outcome being basically, how do employment opportunities change for everybody who was born in Romania? I mean, clearly it's challenging because obviously at the same time that these countries gain access to posting, most of them also get access to the domestic labor market through migration. So to the host labor market through migration because they joined the EU. So you have to think carefully exactly what to do, but I think it would be an interesting way of thinking about the size of things. That's probably one of my biggest comments. On the other stuff, I mean, everyone didn't see it because Matilde only kind of showed part of the paper. I mean, the paper has a lot of kind of different kind of pieces that use different reforms. I'm not going to read through this list, but what you can tell is that they're all from different countries, basically. And I do think that makes a little, I don't know if external validity is really the right word, but it does make it a bit hard to compare estimates. So for example, she has some really nice, elasticities that she estimates from trade data, from the posting data that also comes from natural experiments. She shows those are very similar. Then she's got data kind of on the impact on firms and employees, which just focus on Portugal. And of course, Portugal is a particular country. So this finding that that the workers get 10% and the firms get 20%. You know, we don't know if that would happen with other EU countries. And especially, I think it's on my last slide also. I mean, Portugal to me might not be the right country to ask this question, since it's an older EU country, and it doesn't have huge rates of posting. So I guess this is my last. I'm not keeping track of my own time, but in the big picture, I mean, when Matilda did a really good job of presenting. But when you read the paper, it kind of reads like a lot of papers, like 4 or 5 of them combined. Or I don't know if you've already been asked to write something for the JAP, it would be a very nice JAP paper. I kind of see 3 different papers in your paper. So I hope this is a useful suggestion, or maybe even 4. I mean, clearly there's a very nice descriptive paper on just the use of non-tradable offshoring. You know, you could write this up as a 6-page paper that probably could get published quite nicely, since it's a really new topic. You know, there's kind of the gravity estimates of the employment, basically what you focused on mostly today, the gravity estimates of the employment using the EU expansion as identification, and then the supporting evidence from the 3 case studies. I mean, to me, that's a paper on its own, because you have to do so much work in there already. You have a model, you have theory, you have a identification strategy, you have 3 case studies. And then one of the ones you didn't show today, which I liked a lot, which was the impact on a major receiving country. So she does a lot of work showing what happens in France, which is nice because, you know, France really does receive a lot of people. And then of course, people are coming at different times because of different additions to the EU. She also has data on Belgium. She could do this. I think that she could also do what she does on France. So I kind of saw that as I don't know. I mean, it's not that they can't sit together, but it just seems very difficult to have a normal length paper while you have these all together in one paper. And they have and they have different problems that you need to think about. Like I said I kind of just mentioned on the last slide, I like the firm level analysis, but it did seem a bit problematic to me to look at Portugal. I mean, she does identification by thinking about basically comparing firms, the timing of when firms start posting. There are a lot of potential endogeneity issues around that. She does try to do a good job of capturing this, like in a difference framework. I think it would be nicer to try, if you want to do this type of analysis, I mean, clearly an Eastern European country would be much more interesting, since they really do use posting a lot. And for example, I know Hungary has very good linked employer-employee data. I don't know if it has the information on the posting. I'm sure there's some other people in this room or other people around who could also suggest other potential countries. I don't know the accessibility either. I'm not telling you to collect more data either, since she's collected like 10 data sets already. That's my last, that's all I've got. But yeah, thanks a lot, Matilda. It's a super interesting work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. As always. So I would like to see whether we have any questions from the audience first. If not, Matilda, you can reply to Steve's comments. If you have any questions, please unmute yourself and direct your questions to Matilda.
I would like to ask a question about the data. Hi, thanks for the very interesting presentation. So 2 things. One is, so if you compare it with migration, a person migrates once and then it's done. But if you compare it with posting, a person can be posted 10 times a year. So of course it's larger than migration. So I was wondering what you think about it. And the second thing is that I know for Germany, we had a huge increase in posting just because we needed these A1 forms to go on business trips. So if I go to a conference in London, I need an A1 form. So I didn't need this before 2019. So I was wondering to what extent this is just because we need this A1 forms now for traveling.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to answer quickly to the data questions and then more lengthily to for the A1 form. Yeah, that's true that Germany implemented something in 2019. So I stopped in 2017. I just removed after 2017. Why? Because there are so many enforcement things regarding the A1 that has been implemented. And then you have variations that are not really linked to the change in postings, and so therefore it's not good. But when you to check the reliability of the A1, it's quite interesting, because if you look at the overall increase in A1 forms that I showed you in my graph, and then you look at, for instance, in firm level data that are very good in Portugal, the overall increase in export of services through posting, you see the exact same trend, and same in all other micro level posting. So it seems that overall A1 form are quite good. They're not perfect, but it's the best we have to measure a continent-wide phenomena, which is always really difficult. Regarding comparison with migration, yeah, I mean, it's not the same thing. That's what I was trying to convey. It's different. And so I think it is larger in the sense that, I mean, for the posting forms, even if you are let's say you're posting to do 2 construction work in France, but maybe you're only going to have 1 posting form, which is just going to be the social security, not really the posting contract, right? And so I think it's just tend to be a measure of how many people are exposed to international opportunity, even if it's not, even if it's for 3 days or 2 weeks. And when you look at microdata, for instance, in France, again, the number of workers that are actually posted to France each year is much larger than migrants permanently arriving in France from Europe. So, I mean, of course, they're not going to stay the same duration and so on. And it's really a different phenomena somehow. But I think it just allows to kind of increase, or let's say it differently. If you want to understand how many people in the EU are exposed to international integration, it would be a mistake to do not take into account trade-related mobility flows. I think that was more the point I was trying to convey. Okay, so 4 Steven questions. So regarding the migration thing, I actually can look at transition from posting to migration in Belgium, which I did. And I think it's now became like a second project where I'm going to look at migration friction, and what I document is actually a little bit counterintuitive maybe to what people usually think in the migration literature. It does not seem that transition from posting to standard migration is so large. And why? And this is, I think, related to the demographics. I'll show you differences between posted workers and migrants. Maybe posted workers tend to be different people from migrants, so they tend to be older, they tend to have maybe more attachment to their origin labor market and so on, and therefore they are posted abroad, but their counterfactor would not necessarily be getting established in another country. And I think one thing that is related, if we think a little bit about the big picture, is that actually the large migration waves that have occurred after 2004 and 2007 has been quite concentrated in some countries like Ireland, the UK, a little bit Germany, and a little bit Spain for Romania. But overall, some countries that are known to have a lot of rigidities, in particular language, but also administrative registries, such as France, Austria, and Belgium, they actually saw very little migration wave from Eastern Europe, but they had a lot of posting. So these also tend to suggest that there are some migration frictions, and maybe posting is a way to move abroad that is easier for these people than migration. And there are a lot of points. For the external validity, I do agree. It was the best data I had on exporting firms through posting, so this is what I used. And of course, it would be wonderful to have, but it's really difficult to have international level data for firms and workers. It's really difficult. So we are currently with other researchers, so Yvonne is part of this project, Frederic as well, trying to group a lot of data for a lot of European countries on trading services and mobility that we hope researchers are going to be able to use. And so hopefully we're going to be able to have this data in Eastern European countries. Orbis and Amadeus data could be a first try, of course. And yeah, I agree. There are many papers. It's my job market paper. It will not be published like this, probably. So yeah, but thank you so much for the comments. It's really, really useful.
If I may add something to the great presentation of Mathilde, of course, but also to the question of Steven with regard to, well, the shift from posting to labor migration. I think when you look at, well, the incentive and the reason you are posted, it's strongly employer driven, of course. And here you have to make a distinction between what's the reason of labor migration. That's, well, a personal decision in the end, mostly the case. Well, in posting, it's all the time, well, an employer-driven decision. You are posted to another member state to provide services for a very short period of time. Another reason that there is certainly not a shift from posting to migration is, well, the reason of standard of living, because do not forget that there is also the Posting of Workers Directive. So if you are posted, for instance, from Poland to Germany, the German wage should be paid to that posted worker. So it will not be the Polish wage that will be posted. So always keep that in mind, that it will be the German wage to be paid while he is living still in Poland. So the standard of living, and in the end also his net wage will increase a lot, of course, that he can spend still in Poland. So there is actually no reason to move or to stay in Germany, not at all. So so that's just I would like to add, but I think it's great work, Mathilde, and I was also very glad to hear that this might be a new research area, because here in Europe we are discussing this a lot, posting of workers, but most of the time in the context of social dumping. Well, I think it's a very important, and has become a very type of labor mobility in Europe. While most of the time focus only on, the traditional types of labor migration, or for instance, also cross-border workers. While we know that this has become an increasing type of labor mobility. So thanks, Mathilde.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on the minimum wage. I mean, I didn't have the time, but I also look at the paper at actually all the implementation of minimum wage can be used as some sort of a trade tariff by destination country to regulate posted workers flows. And then it also leads to very different consideration when you want to evaluate the welfare effects of all of these, because you have to decide what is the price index of posted workers. Do they consume in Poland? Do they consume in Germany? What is their wage, and so on? So it's kind of like a hybrid phenomenon between commuting, migration, and yeah, that's big for sure, and we need more work on this. So it's great.
Thanks, Matilda. So before we end this session, I would like to check again whether there are any final questions or remarks. Okay, great then. Many thanks to our presenters. Many thanks to our discussants. In 15 minutes, we will have Ran Abrametsky, and he's going to deliver his keynote speech. Probably it's going to be his earliest keynote speech ever. It's going to be probably 9 or 10 a.m. California time. So we will be back in 15 minutes, 5 p.m. London time. Thank you very much.
Hello, Perry. Good afternoon. You look lost. It's Elsina. Elsina Jeffers, I'm calling from London. You can't see me. Okay.